Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation. Marshall Ramsey stood in his study, examining the quarterly reports from his construction company. 20 years of backbreaking work had built Ramsey Construction into one of the most respected firms in Northern California. At 45, his hands still bore the calluses from his early days swinging hammers, though now those same hands signed million-dollar contracts. The military had taught him discipline, strategy, and most importantly, how to identify threats before they struck. 12 years as a Navy SEAL had honed instincts that served him well in business and life. His wife Tricia often joked that he approached their marriage like a military operation, always 3 steps ahead, always prepared. She had no idea how right she was. Marshall's phone buzzed with a text from his 12-year-old daughter Emma. "Dad, can you pick me up from Sarah's house?" Mom said she had to work late again. The 3rd time this week. Tricia's sudden dedication to her interior design career seemed to coincide with their daughter needing more rides, more help with homework, more of everything that Tricia used to handle effortlessly. As he drove through the affluent neighborhoods toward Emma's friend's house, Marshall reflected on his wife's recent changes. Tricia Carlson had been different when they met 15 years ago. Ambitious but grounded, beautiful but not vain. She'd supported him through the grueling early years of building his business, even working as his bookkeeper when they couldn't afford proper staff. But success had changed her. The designer clothes, the expensive spa treatments, the constant need for validation from her wealthy friends. Marshall had provided everything she wanted, hoping it would bring back the woman he'd fallen in love with. Instead, it seemed to feed an insatiable hunger for more. Emma emerged from the house, her auburn hair catching the late afternoon sun. She had inherited her mother's beauty, but her father's steel-gray eyes and keen intelligence. At 12, she was already showing signs of a strategic thinking that ran in the Ramsey bloodline. "How was school, kiddo?" Marshall asked as she buckled her seatbelt. "Fine. Dad, can I ask you something?" "Always." Emma hesitated, unusually uncertain. If someone was lying to you about something important, would you want to know? Marshall's hands tightened imperceptibly on the steering wheel. "That depends on the situation. But generally, yes. Truth is always better than comfortable lies. Even if it would hurt. Especially then, pain from truth heals. Pain from living a lie just festers." Emma nodded thoughtfully and stared out the window for the rest of the drive. That evening, Marshall returned home to find Tricia in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in hushed tones. She quickly ended the call when she saw him. "Who was that?" he asked casually. "Just Jackie from the design firm. We're working on the Henderson project." Marshall knew Jackie Wall personally. She was married to one of his subcontractors. Jackie was direct, practical, and had never spoken to Tricia in hushed tones about anything. "How's the project coming along?" "Oh, you know how it is. Demanding clients, tight deadlines." Tricia avoided his eyes, busying herself with dinner preparations. Marshall watched his wife move around their kitchen, the kitchen he'd renovated himself as a surprise for their 10th anniversary. Every detail had been perfect, from the custom cabinets to the imported Italian marble countertops. He wanted to give her something beautiful, something that would make her smile every time she walked into the room. Now, she couldn't even look at him. Over dinner, Emma chatted about school while Tricia picked at her food, checking her phone frequently. Marshall made mental notes of every tell, every micro-expression, every deviation from normal behavior. The way she touched her neck when Emma mentioned her college fund. The slight flush when the conversation turned to weekend plans. After Emma went to bed, Marshall found Tricia in their bedroom, applying an expensive night cream he didn't remember buying. "Trish, we need to talk about Emma's college fund." Her hand froze for just a moment before continuing its circular motions. "What about it?" "The quarterly statement came today. I'd like to review it with you." "Why?" "You've never been interested in the details before." "Because our daughter's future is important to me. I want to make sure we're on track." Tricia set down the cream and turned to face him. "Marshall, you worry too much. I handle all our financial planning. Trust me. Trust." The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. I do trust you, he said carefully. That's why I know you won't mind if we look at it together. Fine. Tomorrow. I'm tired tonight. As Tricia settled into bed beside him, Marshall stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. The college fund contained $180,000, money he'd been methodically contributing to since Emma was born. If something had happened to it, he needed to know. But more than that, he needed to know why the woman beside him felt like a stranger. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Facade. The next morning brought answers Marshall wished he'd never sought. The college fund account showed a balance of $23,000. Over the past 8 months, systematic withdrawals had drained nearly everything, all authorized by Tricia's electronic signature. Marshall sat in his truck outside the bank, staring at the printed statements. Each withdrawal was dated and timed. He cross-referenced them with his calendar, his travel schedule, Emma's activities. A pattern emerged that made his blood run cold. Every withdrawal coincided with days when he was out of town on business. Days when Tricia claimed to be working late. Days when Emma needed rides to friends' houses because mom had appointments. His phone rang. Glenn McBride, his business partner and oldest friend. Marsh, you sitting down? What is it, Glenn? I just got a call from Alex Riley. You know him, right? That real estate agent Tricia's been working with on the Henderson project. Marshall's grip tightened on the phone. What about him? He wants to meet with you. Says it's about a business opportunity, but something feels off. Guy seemed nervous as hell. Alex Riley. Marshall knew the name, but had never met the man. Tricia had mentioned him several times over the past few months, always in the context of work, always casually, always with just a little too much enthusiasm in her voice. Set up the meeting, Marshall said. This afternoon, if possible. You sure? I got a weird vibe from this guy. I'm sure. Marshall spent the drive to his office planning his approach. In the military, intelligence gathering was about patience, observation, and letting the enemy reveal their weaknesses. Alex Riley was about to become an unwitting informant. The meeting took place at a downtown restaurant, neutral ground that Alex had suggested. Marshall arrived early, choosing a table that gave him clear sight lines and an unobstructed exit. Old habits died hard. Alex Riley was exactly what Marshall expected. Late 30s, perfectly styled hair, expensive suit that screamed successful but not quite wealthy. The kind of man who drove a leased BMW and lived in a trendy apartment he couldn't really afford. Mr. Ramsey, thanks for meeting with me. Alex's handshake was firm, but his palm was sweaty. I've heard great things about your company. From Tricia, a flicker of something, surprise, fear, crossed Alex's face. Among others, your reputation in the industry speaks for itself. They ordered drinks and made small talk about the local construction market. Alex was smooth, practiced, but Marshall detected the tells of a man under pressure. The way he touched his collar when lying. The slight delay before answering direct questions. The fake smile that never reached his eyes. So what's this business opportunity? Marshall asked. I have a client looking to develop a luxury housing project. 50 units, high-end finishes, beautiful location in the hills. The kind of project that could be very profitable for the right contractor. What's the budget? $12 million, give or take. Marshall leaned back in his chair. That's a significant project. Why not go with one of the bigger firms? Morrison Construction, Davies Brothers? The client specifically requested you. Said your attention to detail was exactly what they were looking for. And this client is... Alex hesitated. They prefer to remain anonymous until we have preliminary agreements in place. Marshall nodded as if this made perfect sense, while every instinct screamed that Alex was lying. No serious developer stayed anonymous at this stage. No real project worth $12 million started with vague meetings in restaurants. But he played along, asking technical questions, discussing timelines, watching Alex fumble through answers about engineering requirements and permit processes. The man knew just enough to sound credible to someone who didn't understand construction. I'll need to see the site, Marshall said finally. Of course. I can arrange that for early next week. As they prepared to leave, Marshall's phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Dad, Mom's working late again. Can you pick me up from Jessica's? Sorry. Marshall said to Alex. Parental duties call. No problem. I understand. Beautiful family, by the way. Trisha's show me pictures. The comment landed like a physical blow. Marshall kept his expression neutral, but inside, a cold fury began to build. She's shown you pictures? Just the one of your daughter's school play. Trisha was so proud. Said Emma wants to be an actress. Emma had never expressed any interest in acting. The school play Alex mentioned had been 2 years ago, and there was only one photo from that event, a picture that sat on Trisha's desk in their home office. Marshall drove toward Jessica's house, his mind racing. Alex Riley wasn't just some real estate agent Trisha worked with professionally. He'd been in their home. He'd seen personal photos. He knew details about their family that no business associate should know. Emma climbed into the truck with an unusually serious expression. Dad, we need to talk. What's wrong, kiddo? Remember what I asked yesterday? About whether you'd want to know if someone was lying to you. Marshall pulled over to the side of the road and turned to face his daughter. Emma, what's going on? She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind she used for school projects. I've been recording things. Things I thought you should know about. What kind of things? Mom's phone calls. The ones she makes when she thinks I'm not listening. Emma's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. Dad, she's been talking to a man named Alex. A lot. And it's not about work. Marshall felt the world shift beneath him. His 12-year-old daughter had been conducting surveillance on her own mother. Emma, why didn't you come to me sooner? I wasn't sure at first. I knew something was wrong, but I thought maybe I was imagining it. Then last week, I heard her tell him that she loved him. The words hit Marshall like a sniper's bullet, precise, devastating, final. But along with the pain came something else, pride. His daughter had the instincts of a natural intelligence operative. She'd identified a threat, gathered evidence, and reported her findings up the chain of command. Do you want to hear it? Emma asked quietly. Marshall looked at his daughter, really looked at her. She was 12 years old, but her eyes held an understanding far beyond her years. She'd already lost her innocence, already learned that the people you trust most could betray you without hesitation. Yes, he said. I want to hear it. Chapter 3. Intelligence Gathered. That evening, after Trisha left for another late client meeting, Marshall and Emma sat in his study with the door locked. The digital recorder sat on his desk like a piece of evidence in a court case. Emma had been methodical in her surveillance. Over 3 weeks, she'd recorded 17 phone conversations, 12 text message readings, and 4 in-person conversations she'd overheard from her bedroom. The first recording was devastating enough. Alex, I can't keep doing this. Marshall's getting suspicious. Baby, we talked about this. You said you were ready to leave him. I am, but it's complicated. There's Emma to think about and the business. The money will cover everything. We can start fresh in Colorado. I already found us a place. Marshall paused the recording. Colorado. Emma nodded grimly. There's more. The subsequent recordings painted a picture of systematic deception that went far beyond simple adultery. Trisha and Alex had been planning to drain the college fund completely, sell Emma's trust fund bonds, which required Marshall's signature, and disappear together. But the most damning recording came from just 3 days ago. Marshall will never sign the trust fund papers willingly. So we make him. You know his weaknesses. The man would do anything for Emma. What are you suggesting? Nothing dramatic. Just leverage. A little accident, maybe. Something that makes him realize how dangerous his line of work can be. Marshall stopped the recording, his hands clenched into fists. They weren't just planning to steal from him. They were discussing ways to threaten Emma's safety to manipulate him. Dad! Emma's voice was small. Are you okay? Marshall looked at his daughter, seeing not the child he'd been protecting, but a young woman who'd already proven herself more loyal and brave than her own mother. Emma, I need you to listen carefully. What you've done here, the recording, the investigation, it took real courage. But I need you to promise me something. Anything. From now on, this stays between us. No one else can know about these recordings. Not your mother, not your friends, nobody. Can you do that? Yes, sir. The military response came naturally to her, and Marshall felt a surge of pride mixed with sadness. His daughter shouldn't have to be a soldier in a war she didn't start. There's something else, Emma said hesitantly. I saw Mom packing a suitcase yesterday. She hid it in the back of her closet, behind her winter coats. Marshall's mind immediately shifted into tactical mode. Tricia was preparing to run, which meant the timeline had accelerated. Whatever they were planning, it was imminent. Emma, I need you to act completely normal around your mother. Can you do that? No matter what happens over the next few weeks, I need you to pretend everything is fine. What are you going to do? Marshall considered his words carefully. Emma deserved honesty, but she was still 12 years old. I'm going to handle this situation. But first, I need to make sure you're safe. That night, after Emma went to bed, Marshall made 3 phone calls. The first was to his brother Omar Graves, a private investigator who specialized in corporate security. Omar had followed Marshall into the military, but stayed stateside, eventually parlaying his skills into a successful investigation business. I need a full background check on Alex Riley, real estate agent, downtown office. And I need surveillance on my wife. Professional grade, not amateur hour. Jesus, Marsh. What's going on? I'll fill you in tomorrow. How fast can you move on this? Give me 48 hours for the background, 12 hours to set up surveillance. The second call was to his lawyer, Nicholas Gilbert, who handled both business and personal matters for the Ramsey family. Nick, hypothetically, if someone forged my signature to access Emma's trust fund, what would be the legal ramifications? Fraud, identity theft, potentially grand theft, depending on the amounts. We're talking federal charges. Marshall, why? Just covering all my bases. I'll be in touch. The third call was to Glenn McBride. That meeting with Alex Riley? Set up another one. Tell him I'm interested in moving forward with the project, but I want to see the site first. Make it happen fast. Marsh, what the hell is going on? I'll explain later. Right now, I need you to trust me and do exactly what I ask. As Marshall lay in bed beside his sleeping wife, he felt the familiar calm that came before action. In the SEALs, this was the moment when planning transitioned to execution, when all the intelligence, preparation, and strategic thinking crystallized into decisive action. Tricia shifted beside him, murmuring something in her sleep. He studied her profile in the dim light, trying to remember when he'd first noticed the changes. The new jewelry she claimed was costume, but looked expensive. The sudden interest in fitness that required a gym membership across town. The gradual emotional distance that he'd attributed to stress from her business. All of it made sense now. His phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at the screen, expecting a message from Omar or Glenn. Instead, it was from an unknown number. I know about the recordings. We need to talk. Tomorrow. Alone. Or Emma pays the price. Marshall's blood turned to ice. He looked at Tricia, still apparently asleep beside him. Then he quietly made his way to Emma's room, checking the locks on her windows, ensuring the security system was armed. Someone had just made the gravest mistake of their life. They'd threatened his daughter. Chapter 4. The Art of War. Marshall didn't sleep. Instead, he spent the pre-dawn hours in his study, planning 3 different operational scenarios while monitoring Emma's room through the security cameras he'd installed years ago. At 5:30 a.m., his phone rang. Omar, I've got preliminary information on your boy Alex Riley. Want the good news or the bad news first? Bad news. He's not just a real estate agent. Guy's got a history of targeting wealthy married women. 3 different cities over the past 10 years. Always the same pattern. Affair, financial manipulation, disappearance. And the good news? He's sloppy. Left a paper trail in Portland that suggests he's got gambling debts to some very unfriendly people. The kind who break kneecaps for late payments. Marshall processed this information. How much does he owe? Close to 200 grand, based on what I can piece together. That's probably why he's pushing the timeline with your wife. Speaking of which, did you get surveillance set up? Vans parked 3 blocks from your house with clear sight lines. My guy Tommy's got military experience. He knows how to stay invisible. At 7 a.m., Marshall watched Tricia go through her morning routine, every movement now loaded with new meaning. She was careful not to wake him, tiptoeing around the bedroom as she gathered clothes for what she claimed was a client site visit. Emma appeared in the kitchen just as Tricia was leaving. Mom, Can you drive me to school today? Emma asked innocently. Sorry, honey. I have an early appointment. Your dad can take you. Marshall emerged from the hallway. No problem. Ready in 10 minutes, kiddo. Tricia kissed his cheek, a gesture that felt like a betrayal in itself, and headed for the garage. Marshall waited until he heard her car pull away before turning to Emma. Did you get the text I forwarded you last night? Emma nodded grimly. She'd already proven herself capable of handling adult situations, and Marshall had decided to treat her as the operational asset she'd become. I want you to stay with your Uncle Omar today. Call in sick to school. Dad, I'm not running away from this. You're not running. You're being strategically repositioned while I handle the immediate threat. He handed her a prepaid cell phone. This is for emergencies only. If anything happens, you call this number. He showed her Omar's contact information. If Omar doesn't answer, you call 911. What about you? I'm going to have a conversation with Alex Riley. 20 minutes later, Marshall dropped Emma at Omar's downtown office, a converted warehouse that served as headquarters for Graves investigations. Omar met them at the entrance, his familiar bulk reassuring in the morning light. She's safer here than anywhere else, Omar said, reading Marshall's expression. Tommy's watching the house, Jake's on your wife, and I got 2 guys ready to move if things go sideways. Marshall clasped his brother's shoulder. Thanks. Just don't do anything that'll put you in prison. Emma needs at least one parent who's not a sociopath. At 10 a.m., Marshall walked into Alex Riley's downtown office, a glass-fronted space in a trendy complex that screamed expensive but not profitable. The receptionist, a young woman with perfect teeth and dead eyes, directed him to Alex's private office. Alex was on the phone when Marshall entered, gesturing dramatically while discussing market projections and investment opportunities. He motioned for Marshall to sit while he finished the call. Marshall remained standing. When Alex finally hung up, his smile was as fake as everything else about him. Marshall, great to see you again. Ready to look at that development site? Actually, I want to discuss something else first. Marshall placed a printed screenshot of a text message on the desk. This came from your phone last night. Alex's face went pale as he read his own thread about Emma. I don't know what this is. It's a text message you sent to my phone at 11:47 p.m., threatening my daughter's safety if I didn't meet with you alone. Marshall, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding is that you thought you could threaten my family and walk away from it. Marshall's voice remained calm, conversational. See, Alex, I know about the affair. I know about the college fund. I know about your gambling debts and your history of targeting wealthy women. Alex stood abruptly, moving toward the door. Marshall's hand shot out, gripping Alex's wrist with just enough pressure to make his point clear. Sit down. Alex sat. Here's what's going to happen, Marshall continued. You're going to call Tricia and tell her the plan has changed. Tell her you need to leave town immediately. Gambling debts, dangerous people, whatever story you want to use. But you're going alone. And if I don't? Marshall smiled for the first time since entering the office. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Alex, I spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL. I know 47 different ways to kill a man with my bare hands, and about half of them look like accidents. Alex's breathing became shallow. You're threatening me. No, I'm explaining your options. Option 1. You disappear from my family's life permanently, and I let you deal with your gambling debts however you see fit. Option 2. I make sure your creditors know exactly where to find you, along with detailed information about your financial situation and current location. You can't. Option 3. Marshall continued as if Alex hadn't spoken, is that I decide you're an ongoing threat to my daughter's safety, and I handle threats permanently. The color drained completely from Alex's face. What's it going to be? Alex's hands shook as he reached for his phone. I'll call her. I'll tell her I have to leave. Speakerphone. Alex dialed Tricia's number with trembling fingers. Marshall listened as his wife's voice filled the office, full of concern and affection for the man who'd helped her betray their family. Alex, what's wrong? You sound upset. Tricia, I have to leave. Tonight, some people from Portland found me, and if I don't get out of town... What people? Alex, you're scaring me. The ones I owe money to. They're not the kind of people who negotiate. There was a long pause. What about our plans? What about Colorado? I can't take you with me. It's too dangerous. Maybe in a few months, when things cool down. Marshall could hear Tricia crying through the phone. The sound should have moved him. This was still the woman he'd loved for 15 years. Instead, he felt only cold satisfaction. I love you, Tricia whispered. I love you too, Alex replied, his eyes fixed on Marshall's face. But I have to go. After the call ended, Marshall stood. You have 6 hours to be out of the state. If I see you again, if you contact my wife again, if I even hear your name mentioned in this town, I will end you. Do we understand each other? Alex nodded frantically. Oh, and Alex, the money you took from my daughter's college fund. You're going to return every penny. I don't have it. I already paid most of it to my creditors. Marshall leaned across the desk, his face inches from Alex's. Then you better figure out how to get it back. Because if Emma's college fund isn't fully restored by the end of the week, those gambling debts will be the least of your problems. As Marshall walked out of the office, he felt the familiar rush of a mission accomplished. Phase 1 was complete. Now it was time to deal with his wife. Chapter 5, The Reckoning. Marshall returned home to find Tricia sitting at their kitchen table, still in her work clothes, staring at her phone with tears streaming down her face. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment, he saw a glimpse of the woman he'd married. Vulnerable, lost, genuinely devastated. Then he remembered the recordings Emma had made, and his sympathy hardened into tactical assessment. Rough day at work? He asked, hanging up his keys. Tricia wiped her eyes. Alex had to leave town suddenly. Some kind of family emergency. The lie came so easily that Marshall wondered how many others he'd missed over the years. How many client meetings and work emergencies had actually been something else entirely. That's unfortunate. I hope everything works out for him. Marshall, can we talk? I mean, really talk. Marshall sat across from her at the table where they'd shared thousands of meals, where Emma had done homework, where they'd planned their life together. What's on your mind? I think we need to consider some changes in our marriage. Marshall kept his expression neutral. What kind of changes? I've been thinking about what I want out of life. What makes me happy? And I don't think this, she gestured around the kitchen, is working anymore. This being our marriage? Marshall, we're different people than we were 15 years ago. We want different things. Maybe it would be better if we took some time apart. The conversation felt surreal. His wife was asking for separation while sitting in the kitchen he'd built for her, surrounded by the life he'd worked 18-hour days to provide, apparently oblivious to the fact that he knew about her affair. What about Emma? She's resilient. Kids adapt. And it's not like we'd be fighting or anything. We could handle this maturely, like adults. Marshall studied Tricia's face, noting the micro-expressions that revealed her true emotional state. The slight elevation of her left eyebrow when she mentioned Emma, a tell that indicated she was lying about something important. The way she touched her wedding ring while talking about separation, a subconscious gesture suggesting guilt. Have you thought about counseling first? Trying to work through whatever problems we're having. Tricia's pause lasted just a beat too long. I don't think counseling would help. Some things can't be fixed, Marshall, such as, we don't connect anymore. When was the last time we really talked? Really shared something meaningful? The irony was devastating. They were having the most meaningful conversation of their marriage, and she had no idea. You're right, Marshall said finally. We should separate. Surprise flashed across Tricia's face. Apparently she'd expected more resistance. Really, if that's what you want, then yes. I won't force you to stay in a marriage that makes you unhappy. What about the house? And Emma's custody? Marshall had spent hours that morning with Nicholas Gilbert, mapping out the legal landscape. We'll work out the details. I assume you'll want to move out fairly quickly. Actually, I was thinking maybe you could stay somewhere else for a while, just until we figure things out permanently. Of course, she wanted him out of the house so she could continue her deception more easily, probably hoping Alex would change his mind about leaving town once the coast was clear. That worked for me. I could stay at Glenn's place for a few weeks. Relief flooded Tricia's features. Thank you for being so understanding about this. I know it can't be easy. Marshall stood and moved to the window, watching a neighbor walk their dog in the fading afternoon light. Trisha, can I ask you something? Of course. In all the years we've been married, have you ever felt like I didn't support your dreams? Like I held you back somehow? The question caught her off guard. No, Marshall, you've always been supportive. This isn't about anything you did wrong. Then what is it about? A long pause. Sometimes people just grow apart. It's nobody's fault. Marshall turned back to face her. You're right. Sometimes they do. That evening, after Trisha left for what she claimed was a dinner with girlfriends, Marshall packed a suitcase. But instead of going to Glenn's house, he drove to a downtown hotel where Omar had reserved a suite under a false name. Emma was waiting for him in the sitting area, homework spread across the coffee table. How did it go with Alex? She asked without looking up from her math problems. Alex won't be bothering us anymore. And Mom? She asked for separation. Emma's pencil stopped moving. Are you going to give her one? Marshall sat beside his daughter on the couch. Emma, I want you to know that none of this is your fault. And no matter what happens between your mother and me, that will never change how much I love you. I know that, Dad, but that's not what I asked. Marshall smiled despite the circumstances. His daughter's directness was refreshing after hours of Trisha's manipulation and Alex's lies. Yes, I'm going to give her a separation. In fact, I'm going to give her exactly what she wants. Emma looked up from her homework. Why do I get the feeling that's not good news for Mom? Because you're smart enough to understand that sometimes getting what you want isn't the same as getting what you need. Over the next 3 days, Marshall orchestrated his apparent departure from the family home with military precision. He made a show of moving clothes and personal items to Glenn's house, complained to mutual friends about Trisha's sudden desire for space, and played the role of the confused, hurt husband perfectly. Meanwhile, Omar's surveillance team documented every move Trisha made. She contacted Alex 17 times in the first 2 days, growing increasingly frantic when he didn't respond. She drove past his office building 4 times. She even called the hospital to ask if anyone named Alex Riley had been admitted. On the 3rd day, she did something that confirmed Marshall's worst suspicions about her character. She went to Emma's school and checked her out early, claiming a family emergency. Then she drove to the bank. Omar's man Tommy followed them inside and watched from a distance as Trisha attempted to access Emma's trust fund. The account required 2 signatures, Marshall's and Trisha's, but Tommy observed her practicing Marshall's signature on a piece of scrap paper. She was planning to forge his name. Tommy's earpiece crackled with Omar's voice. She's going to try it. Get pictures of everything. But Emma, sitting beside her mother at the bank manager's desk, spoke up in a clear, carrying voice. Mom, didn't Dad say we needed to wait until he got back from his business trip before we did anything with my college money? The bank manager looked confused. I thought you said your husband was aware of this transaction, Mrs. Ramsey. Trisha's face flushed. He is. Emma's just confused about the timeline. Actually, Emma continued innocently, I'm pretty sure Dad said not to touch my trust fund without him being here. Maybe we should wait. The bank manager was now clearly uncomfortable. Mrs. Ramsey, given the amount involved and the requirement for dual signatures, I think it would be best if your husband were present for this transaction. Trisha gathered her purse with barely controlled frustration. Fine. We'll come back when he's available. As they left the bank, Tommy captured audio of Trisha angrily scolding Emma in the parking lot. Why did you say that? I'm your mother. You're supposed to trust me. Emma's response was barely audible, but devastating. Maybe if you told the truth more often, it would be easier to trust you. That evening, Marshall received Omar's full report along with photos and audio recordings. His 12-year-old daughter had single-handedly prevented a felony from being committed, while simultaneously exposing her mother's true intentions for the world to see. As he reviewed the evidence, Marshall felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. Trisha had made her choice. She'd chosen betrayal over loyalty, deception over honesty, selfishness over family. Now, she was going to learn the price of that choice. It was time for Phase 2. Chapter 6. The Trap is Set. Marshall spent the weekend at Omar's warehouse, planning the next phase of his operation with the precision of a military campaign. The space served as an informal war room, with surveillance photos, financial documents, and legal papers spread across a large conference table. She's getting desperate, Omar reported, pointing to time-stamped photographs. Since Alex disappeared, she's been driving past his apartment complex twice a day. Yesterday, she tried to get his forwarding address from the building manager. What about the college fund? According to Nick Gilbert, she's called the bank 3 times asking about expediting the signature process for Emma's account. They keep telling her both parents need to be present. Marshall studied a photograph of Tricia sitting in her car outside Alex's apartment building. Phone pressed to her ear with an expression of barely controlled panic. She's going to make a mistake soon. Desperate people always do. Emma looked up from her laptop, where she'd been working on what appeared to be homework, but was actually helping Omar compile a digital dossier on Alex Riley's previous victims. Dad, I found something interesting. She turned the screen toward him. Alex Riley isn't his real name. His birth name is Alexander Reed. And look at this. She pulled up a newspaper article from Portland. 2 years ago, a woman named Susan Martinez accused him of stealing $50,000 from her late husband's estate. The charges were dropped when she suddenly stopped cooperating with police. Probably paid her off or threatened her, Omar muttered. Or both, Marshall added. What else did you find? Emma navigated to another browser tab. 6 months before that, he was involved in a civil suit with Rebecca Chun in Seattle. Same pattern. Older, wealthy woman, mysterious financial losses. Case dismissed when the plaintiff withdrew her complaint. Marshall felt a surge of pride watching his daughter work. Emma had inherited his analytical mind and attention to detail, but she'd also developed an intuitive understanding of human nature that went beyond her years. There's something else, Emma continued. I cross-referenced the dates of Alex's previous relocations with Mom's credit card statements from the past year. She pulled up a spreadsheet that showed a timeline of Tricia's spending patterns. Look at this. Last February, right after Alex supposedly moved here from Portland, Mom started getting cash advances on her credit cards. Small amounts at first, but they've been increasing. Omar leaned over to examine the data. She's been giving him money. How much? Marshall asked. Emma clicked to his summary tab. $43,000 over the past 10 months. All cash advances, all from different ATMs around the city. The picture was becoming clearer. Alex had identified Tricia as a mark, cultivated the relationship over months, slowly extracted money through the affair, and then escalated to targeting Emma's college fund when Tricia's available credit ran out. Dad, Emma said quietly, there's something else. I checked Mom's browser history on the home computer. Marshall waited. She's been researching divorce law, specifically how assets are divided in California and what rights she'd have to my trust fund if you died. The words hit Marshall like a physical blow. What do you mean if I died? Emma pulled up a series of screenshots. She's been visiting websites about life insurance policies, accidental death benefits, and something called wrongful death settlements. She spent 3 hours last week reading about workplace accidents in the construction industry. Omar and Marshall exchanged glances. The conversation Alex and Tricia had recorded about creating leverage through a little accident suddenly took on a much more sinister meaning. Emma, I want you to print all of this and give it to Nick Gilbert. This is evidence of conspiracy. Already done. I also made backup copies and store them in 3 different cloud accounts. Marshall looked at his daughter with a mixture of awe and sadness. At 12 years old, she was already thinking like a seasoned intelligence operative, protecting evidence and covering operational security. But she should have been worried about middle school drama and homework, not her mother's potential involvement in a murder plot. There's one more thing, Emma said hesitantly. I don't think Mom knows that Alex is really gone. I think she thinks he's just hiding from the gambling people, and that he'll come back for her eventually. Why do you say that? Because she's still acting like someone who has a future plan. She's not acting like someone whose boyfriend just abandoned her. She's acting like someone who's waiting. Marshall considered this. Emma was right. Tricia's behavior suggested she believed Alex would return, which meant she didn't understand that Marshall had discovered their affair and driven Alex away permanently. That gives us an advantage, Marshall said finally. She'll keep following the original plan, thinking Alex is going to reappear at some point. What was the original plan? Omar asked. Marshall pulled out transcripts of the phone conversations Emma had recorded. Based on the recordings, They were planning to drain Emma's trust fund, stage some kind of accident that would make me more cooperative, and then disappear together to Colorado. Jesus. And she thinks this is still happening. As far as she knows, Alex just had to leave town temporarily because of gambling debts. She's probably expecting him to contact her any day with new instructions. Emma, close her laptop. So what do we do? Marshall stood and walked to the window overlooking the city. Below, people were going about their normal lives, working, shopping, spending time with families they could trust. The contrast with his own situation was almost overwhelming. We're going to give her exactly what she wants, he said finally. We're going to let her think the plan is working. Ow! Marshall turned back to face them. Emma, how would you feel about going on a camping trip with your old man? Somewhere remote, somewhere cell phone reception might be spotty. Understanding dawned in Emma's eyes. You want her to think something happened to you. Not something fatal, but something that would explain why I'm not available to sign bank documents or ask inconvenient questions. Omar grinned. A hunting accident, maybe? Something that lands you in a hospital outside the area? Exactly. And while I'm supposedly unconscious in some remote medical facility, Trisha will have the opportunity to show us exactly how far she's willing to go to get what she wants. Emma was quiet for a long moment. Dad, what if she tries to do something to me while you're gone? Marshall knelt beside his daughter's chair. Emma, I would never put you in real danger. Omar's going to be watching you every second, and we'll have backup plans for every possible scenario. But more importantly, I don't think she'll hurt you. You're worth more to her alive than dead. You're the key to the trust fund. Besides, Omar added, your mom doesn't know that you're aware of what's going on. As far as she's concerned, you're still just a 12-year-old kid who doesn't understand adult problems. Emma smiled for the first time in days. She has no idea how much trouble she's in, does she? Marshall returned his daughter's smile. None whatsoever. As they finalized the details of their plan, Marshall felt the familiar calm that came before decisive action. Trisha had made her choice when she betrayed their family. Alex had made his choice when he threatened Emma's safety. Now, they were going to learn that Marshall Ramsey was not a man who forgave betrayal. And he never forgot. Chapter 7. Into the Woods. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn in Northern California. Marshall made his final preparations while Trisha went through her morning routine, unaware that her husband was orchestrating the endgame of their marriage. Emma played her part perfectly at breakfast, chattering about school projects and weekend plans while secretly coordinating with Omar through hand signals they'd practiced. She'd proven herself remarkably adaptable to operational requirements, a skill that would serve her well in the coming days. Dad, can we go camping this weekend? Emma asked as Trisha gathered her purse and work materials. I haven't been to the mountains in forever. That sounds like a great idea, Marshall replied. It's been too long since we had some father-daughter time. Trisha looked up from her phone. Camping? This weekend, just overnight. There's a site up near Lake Tahoe that Emma's been wanting to see. It seems kind of sudden. Marshall shrugged. We both need a break from all the stress lately. Some time in nature might do us good. Emma nodded enthusiastically. Please, Mom. We'll be back Sunday evening. Trisha's expression was conflicted. On one hand, having Marshall and Emma out of town would give her more freedom to contact Alex or handle financial matters. On the other hand, the timing felt coincidental given her recent bank visit. I suppose it would be good for you two to spend time together, she said finally. After Trisha left for work, Marshall made a phone call to Nicholas Gilbert. Nick, I need you to do something for me. Call Trisha this afternoon and tell her you need to meet about updating my life insurance policy. Make it sound routine, but mention that the payout has increased substantially since my business has grown. Marshall, what are you planning? Just reinforcing some information she might find interesting. Can you do it? Yeah, but I'm getting worried about where this is all heading. Trust me, Nick. Everything I'm doing is completely legal. That wasn't entirely true, but Nick didn't need to know about the more aggressive aspects of Marshall's plan. At 3 p.m., Marshall and Emma loaded camping gear in his truck while Omar's surveillance team documented every move from their concealed positions. To any observer, they looked like a father and daughter heading out for a weekend adventure. The reality was significantly more complex. They drove north toward the mountains, but instead of heading to Lake Tahoe, Marshall took a series of back roads that led to an abandoned mining camp Omar had scouted earlier. The location was perfect, remote enough to be believable, but close enough to civilization for rapid extraction if needed. Once they reached the camp, Marshall set up their legitimate camping equipment, while Emma established communication protocols with Omar using satellite phones that couldn't be traced through normal cellular networks. Phase 1 begins at 1800 hours, Marshall said, checking his watch. That gives Trisha time to get home and start wondering why we're not answering our phones. At exactly 6 p.m., Emma placed a call to Trisha's cell phone using a prepaid phone that couldn't be traced to either of them. "Mom? It's Emma. Something happened." Trisha's voice was immediately panicked. "Emma, what's wrong? Where are you?" "We're at the camping site, but Dad had an accident. He was setting up our tent near this cliff, and some rocks gave way." "Oh my God, is he hurt?" Emma's performance was Oscar-worthy. Her voice shook with exactly the right amount of fear and uncertainty. "He fell about 15 feet. He's unconscious, and I can't wake him up. There's blood. Emma, call 911 right now." "I tried, but my phone doesn't have any signal up here. I had to hike to a high spot just to call you." "Where exactly are you?" "I'll call for help." Emma provided coordinates that would lead search teams to the abandoned mining camp, where they would find evidence of an accident, but no actual victims. "Mom, I'm scared. Dad's breathing, but he won't wake up, and I don't know what to do." "Baby, listen to me. I'm going to call 911 and the sheriff's department. They'll send a helicopter to get you both. Just stay with your father and keep him warm, okay?" "Okay. But Mom, what if?" "Don't think like that. Your father is strong. He's going to be fine." After Emma ended the call, Marshall felt a complex mix of emotions. Trisha's panic and concern had sounded genuine, and for a moment, he wondered if he'd misjudged the depth of her betrayal. Then Emma showed him a text message that had arrived on her regular phone during the call. It was from Trisha, sent just 3 minutes after their conversation ended. "Emergency at home. Can't pick you up today. Take the bus." "Mom." The text was intended for Alex, sent to the number she'd been using to contact him for months. Even in the midst of a family crisis, Trisha's first instinct was to reach out to her lover. Marshall's momentary doubt evaporated. 20 minutes later, Emma's satellite phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Omar. "Mountain rescue deployed. Sheriff's helicopter en route to coordinates." Trisha left house immediately after your call, heading toward bank. The trap was working perfectly. While search and rescue teams combed the mountains looking for victims who weren't there, Trisha was racing around town trying to access funds that would soon be frozen by court order. Nick Gilbert had already filed emergency paperwork citing suspicious financial activity and potential fraud, but the legal wheels wouldn't start turning until morning. That gave Trisha exactly one night to reveal her true intentions. At 10 p.m., Emma's regular phone received another call from Trisha. "Emma? Thank God. I've been calling for hours. Are you okay? Where's your father?" Emma's voice was perfectly calibrated to convey exhaustion and trauma. "They airlifted Dad to a hospital in Carson City. The doctors won't tell me anything because I'm not 18. I'm driving there right now." "What hospital?" Emma provided the name of a medical facility that Omar had confirmed would have no record of Marshall's admission. "Mom, they said Dad has a serious head injury. They don't know when he'll wake up." "Oh, baby, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault for letting you go on this trip." "It's not your fault, Mom. It was just an accident." "Emma, listen carefully. I need you to come home with me tonight. We'll drive back to the hospital together in the morning." "But what if Dad wakes up and I'm not here?" "The doctors will call us. Right now, you need rest and a proper meal. You've been through enough." Emma agreed to meet Trisha at the hospital, knowing that Omar's team would intercept them before any actual contact occurred. But the conversation had provided crucial intelligence about Trisha's state of mind. She wasn't rushing to her husband's bedside out of love and concern. She was consolidating assets and preparing for the next phase of her plan. As Marshall and Emma settled into their remote camp for the night, both of them listening to regular updates from Omar's surveillance team, Marshall reflected on how completely his life had changed in just 1 week. 7 days ago, he'd been a successful businessman with a loving family and a bright future. Tonight, he was a man hiding in the wilderness, gathering evidence of his wife's betrayal while his 12-year-old daughter demonstrated tactical skills that would impress seasoned operators. But he felt no regret about the path he'd chosen. Trisha had started this war when she decided to betray their family. Now she was going to discover that Marshall Ramsey always finished what others started, and he never lost. Chapter 8. The Net Closes. Tuesday morning brought news that confirmed Marshall's worst suspicions about his wife's character. Omar's voice crackled through the satellite phone at 6 a.m. "You're not going to believe what she did last night." Marshall and Emma were already breaking camp, preparing for the next phase of their operation. They'd slept in shifts, monitoring communications and ensuring their fictional scenario remained believable to outside observers. "Tell me, after she couldn't find you at the Carson City Hospital, she drove straight home and started packing. Not just clothes, everything valuable. Jewelry, artwork, important documents. Then she made 3 phone calls." Marshall felt his jaw tighten. To who? First call was to a storage facility, reserving a unit under a false name. Second call was to that lawyer Jackie Wall recommended last month, the one who specializes in emergency asset protection. Third call. Omar paused. Third call was to a private medical transport service, asking about the cost of moving an unconscious patient from Carson City to a more specialized facility. Emma looked up from her satellite phone, where she'd been monitoring news reports about the search and rescue operation. She's planning to move Dad somewhere she can control access to him. That's not the worst part, Omar continued. After the phone calls, she drove to 3 different ATMs and maxed out cash advances on every credit card she has access to. Then she went to that 24-hour check cashing place on 5th Street. Marshall's blood ran cold. What was she cashing? That's what Tommy's trying to figure out. But based on the amount of time she spent inside, it wasn't just one check. The implications were staggering. In the span of 12 hours, Trisha had gone from concerned wife to someone systematically liquidating assets and making arrangements to potentially move her unconscious husband to a location where she could control medical decisions. "Omar, I need you to contact Nick Gilbert immediately. Tell him to file for emergency conservatorship and to freeze all joint accounts. Do it now before the banks open." "Already on it." Nick's been at his office since 5 a.m. preparing paperwork. Emma finished packing her gear and looked at her father with an expression far too mature for her 12 years. "Dad, she's not planning to wait for you to wake up, is she?" Marshall considered sugarcoating the truth, but Emma had already proven herself capable of handling adult realities. "No, kiddo, I don't think she is." The satellite phone buzzed with an incoming text from Omar. "Mountain Rescue officially called off search at dawn. Presuming you fell into river, bodies swept downstream. Local news picking up story." Perfect. The fictional accident was now public record, which meant Trisha would have legal justification for any emergency financial decisions she might make. She probably thought she had a narrow window of opportunity before Marshall's body was recovered and death certificates were issued. She had no idea that window was actually a trap. At 9 a.m., Marshall and Emma were hidden in the back of Omar's surveillance van, watching live video feeds from cameras positioned around their house. They watched Trisha return home with 2 men Marshall didn't recognize, both wearing cheap suits and carrying briefcases. "Who are they?" Emma asked. Omar consulted his tablet. "Guy on the left is David Chun, private lawyer who specializes in questionable estate planning. Guy on the right is Marcus Webb, insurance adjuster who's been suspended twice for fraudulent claims processing." Marshall felt his anger crystallize into something cold and sharp. Trisha hadn't just betrayed their marriage. She'd assembled a team of professionals to help her steal Emma's inheritance. They watched as Trisha led the 2 men into Marshall's home office, where they began photographing documents and organizing papers into different stacks. One stack appeared to be insurance policies. Another looked like bank statements and investment records. The third stack was Emma's trust fund documentation. "Dad," Emma said quietly, "are we going to let them take everything?" Marshall's smile was predatory. "Emma, do you remember the first rule of military strategy? Know your enemy better than they know themselves." And the second rule, never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. Emma grinned. So we're going to let them think they're winning? We're going to let them hang themselves with their own rope. Over the next 6 hours, Omar's surveillance team documented every illegal action taken by Tricia and her associates. They recorded conversations about forging Marshall's signature on insurance documents. They photographed Chun helping Tricia practice Marshall's handwriting. They captured Webb on audio explaining how to maximize payouts from accidental death policies. Most damning of all, they recorded Tricia's phone call to the medical transport service. I need to arrange immediate transfer of a patient from Carson City General to a private facility. The patient is unconscious, and I have medical power of attorney. She was planning to have Marshall moved to a location where she could control access to him, potentially until she'd completed her financial manipulations. At 3 p.m., the trap was sprung. Nicholas Gilbert arrived at the house with a sheriff's deputy and a court order freezing all Ramsey family assets, pending investigation of suspected fraud. Omar's surveillance footage had provided sufficient evidence for a judge to issue emergency protective measures. Marshall and Emma watched from the van as Tricia's carefully orchestrated plan collapsed in real time. The lawyer Chin attempted to destroy documents, but was stopped by the deputy. Webb tried to leave through the back door, but found his car blocked by another police vehicle. Tricia herself stood in the middle of her kitchen, the kitchen Marshall had renovated as a gift, and screamed at Nick Gilbert about harassment and illegal search procedures. Mrs. Ramsey, Nick said calmly, "You're welcome to contact your own attorney. But these accounts remain frozen until we can verify the legitimacy of your recent financial activities. My husband is missing, possibly dead. I have every right to protect my family's assets." Actually, you don't. California law requires a waiting period before death can be legally presumed, and it certainly doesn't authorize forgery or insurance fraud. Tricia's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." Nick opened his briefcase and pulled out printed screenshots of the surveillance footage. "Mrs. Ramsey, we have video evidence of you practicing your husband's signature and audio recordings of you discussing fraudulent insurance claims. I strongly recommend you contact a criminal defense attorney." As the sheriff's deputy began reading Tricia her rights, Marshall felt a complex mix of satisfaction and sadness. This was the woman he'd loved for 15 years, the mother of his child, his partner in building a life together. She was also someone who'd been willing to steal from her own daughter and potentially manipulate her husband's medical care for financial gain. Emma touched his arm. "Dad, are you okay?" Marshall looked at his daughter, strong, loyal, intelligent beyond her years, and realized that while he was losing a wife, he was gaining something even more valuable: absolute certainty about who could be trusted. "I'm fine, kiddo. Better than fine, actually. What happens now?" Marshall watched as Tricia was handcuffed and led toward a police car, her carefully constructed plan in ruins around her. Now we finish this. The final phase of Marshall's operation was about to begin, and this time, there would be no escape route for anyone who betrayed his family. Chapter 9. Justice Served. 3 weeks later, Marshall sat in Nicholas Gilbert's office reviewing the final documents that would reshape his family's future. Emma was beside him, no longer the innocent 12-year-old who discovered her mother's betrayal, but a young woman who'd proven herself worthy of his complete trust. "The criminal charges are solid," Nick reported. "Fraud, forgery, attempted grand theft, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. With the evidence Omar collected, Tricia's looking at minimum 5 years, possibly 8 if they can prove the medical transport scheme was intended to facilitate harm." Marshall nodded without emotion. "And the divorce?" "Expedited due to criminal activity. California has provisions for accelerated proceedings when one spouse commits felonies against the family unit. She gets nothing. No alimony, no property division, no custody rights." Emma looked up from her phone, where she'd been tracking the status of Alex Riley's situation. "Dad, Alex was arrested in Nevada yesterday. Apparently those gambling debts caught up with him." Marshall had ensured that information about Alex's location and assets reached the right people at exactly the right time. The 2 men who'd come looking for Alex were not known for their patience with defaulted loans. "What about the money they took?" Emma asked. Nick consulted his notes. Alex managed to return about 60% before his unfortunate encounter with his creditors. The rest will come from the sale of Trisha's personal assets, jewelry, car, everything she tried to hide in that storage unit. So Emma's college fund will be fully restored? With interest, actually, the court ordered punitive damages that more than compensate for the emotional distress caused. Marshall felt a deep satisfaction at this news. Emma's future had been the primary target of Trisha's betrayal, and seeing it not just restored but enhanced felt like justice properly served. There's one more thing, Nick added hesitantly. Trisha's lawyer contacted me yesterday. She wants to meet with you. Something about making amends. Absolutely not, Emma said before Marshall could respond. She had her chance to make amends. She chose Alex instead. Marshall studied his daughter's face, seeing the steel that had emerged over the past month. Emma had lost her innocence, but she'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that she could handle whatever life threw at her. What do you think, kiddo? Should I hear what she has to say? Emma considered this carefully. Dad, you taught me that when someone shows you who they really are, you should believe them. Mom showed us exactly who she is. Meeting with her now just gives her another opportunity to manipulate the situation. Marshall felt a surge of pride. At 12 years old, Emma understood strategic thinking better than most adults. You're right. Nick, tell her lawyer the answer is no. We have nothing to discuss. As they left Nick's office, Emma was unusually quiet. Finally, as they reached Marshall's truck, she spoke. Dad, do you think she ever really loved us? The question hit Marshall harder than any of Trisha's betrayals. I think she loved the idea of us. The security, the lifestyle, the image of being a successful family. But real love, the kind that puts other people before yourself, I don't think she's capable of that. I'm sorry. For what? For recording her phone calls. For spying on my own mother. For helping you trick her. Marshall stopped walking and turned to face his daughter. Emma, look at me. You have nothing to apologize for. What you did wasn't spying, it was protecting your family. You saw a threat, you gathered intelligence, and you reported it to the appropriate authority. That's exactly what you should have done. But she's still my mom. Yes, she is. And that makes what she did even worse, not better. Parents are supposed to protect their children, not steal from them. Emma nodded. But Marshall could see she was still struggling with the complex emotions of having helped bring down her own mother. Kiddo, let me ask you something. If you had to do it all over again, knowing what you know now, would you change anything? Emma thought for a long moment. No, I'd do exactly the same thing. Because protecting you and protecting my future was more important than protecting her lies. Marshall felt his chest tighten with emotion. His daughter had faced an impossible choice and made the right decision, even though it cost her the comfortable illusion of a happy family. I'm proud of you, he said simply, as they drove home to the house that was now truly theirs, free from deception and betrayal. Emma asked one final question. Dad, what if she gets out of prison and tries to contact me? Marshall's expression hardened. That won't happen. How can you be sure? Because part of her plea agreement includes a permanent restraining order. She's legally prohibited from contacting either of us for the rest of her life. If she tries, she goes back to prison. And Alex won't be bothering anyone for a very long time. His creditors were thorough in their collection efforts. Emma didn't ask for details, and Marshall didn't offer them. Some aspects of justice were better left unexamined. That evening, as Emma worked on homework at the kitchen table and Marshall prepared dinner, the house felt peaceful in a way it hadn't in months. The constant undercurrent of tension and deception was gone, replaced by the comfortable quiet of two people who trusted each other completely. Dad, Emma said without looking up from her math problems. Yeah, I know this has been hard for you. Losing Mom, are you going to be okay? Marshall smiled as he watched his daughter, brilliant, loyal, strong, bent over her homework in the kitchen he'd built for a woman who'd never deserved it. Emma, I didn't lose anything important. I found out what was really valuable, which is you, your trust, your loyalty, your courage. Everything else was just illusion. Emma looked up and smiled. So what do we do now? Marshall considered the question. They had their house, their business, their future secured. They had each other tested and proven. They had justice properly served. Most importantly, they had the knowledge that they'd faced betrayal and emerged stronger. Now we live our lives, Marshall said. We build something real, something honest, something that can't be destroyed by other people's selfishness. Just the two of us. For now. But Emma, someday you'll find people worthy of your trust. Real friends, maybe even someone special. And when you do, you'll know how to recognize the difference between genuine loyalty and pretty lies. Emma nodded and returned to her homework. Marshall finished preparing dinner, feeling a contentment he hadn't experienced in years. Outside, night was falling on Northern California. Somewhere, Tricia was beginning her prison sentence, learning the hard way that actions have consequences. Somewhere else, Alex was discovering that betraying the wrong person could have permanent ramifications. But in the kitchen of the house Marshall had built with his own hands, father and daughter shared a quiet meal, secure in the knowledge that they protected what truly mattered. Some betrayals destroyed families. This one had forged something unbreakable. Marshall Ramsey had taught his enemies the most important lesson of his military career. Never underestimate a man protecting his family. And never forget that some battles end only when the enemy can never fight again. The war was over. Marshall had won. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Iron. Vincent Holloway had built his empire on three principles: loyalty, precision, and consequence. At 45, he commanded a private security firm that specialized in corporate protection and crisis management, employing former military personnel who understood that failure wasn't an option. His steel-gray eyes had seen combat in Afghanistan, boardroom wars in Manhattan, and the devastating loss that had nearly broken him 5 years ago. The Holloway estate sat on 12 acres of pristine Connecticut countryside, a testament to Vincent's methodical approach to success. Every detail had been planned, from the hand-carved oak doors to the elaborate garden that had once been his daughter's favorite sanctuary. Emma had been 7 when the cancer took her, a brilliant, spirited child who could name every flower in their garden and had dreams of becoming a botanist like her grandfather. Vincent's wife, Patricia, had been his anchor during Emma's illness. They'd met 12 years ago when she was a nurse at Connecticut General Hospital, where Vincent was recovering from shrapnel wounds. Patricia Morrison had been 26 then, beautiful in an understated way, with auburn hair and compassionate green eyes that seemed to see through his carefully constructed walls. She'd tended to his physical wounds while somehow healing the emotional scars he'd carried from 2 tours overseas. Their courtship had been swift but deep. Patricia understood his need for control, his systematic approach to life, and she'd embraced the structure he brought to their relationship. When Emma was born 2 years later, Vincent believed he'd found his perfect life, a loyal wife, a beautiful daughter, and a growing business that provided them with everything they could want. But cancer doesn't care about perfect lives. Emma's diagnosis had come like a sniper's bullet, sudden, devastating, and life-altering. Vincent had thrown every resource at his disposal into fighting the disease. The best oncologists, experimental treatments, alternative therapies. Nothing was too expensive or too experimental if it might save his daughter. Patricia had been tireless in her care, sleeping in hospital chairs, researching treatments, and maintaining hope when Vincent's military pragmatism wanted to prepare for the worst. When Emma died on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, something fundamental had shifted in Vincent's world. The man who had never lost a battle found himself defeated by an enemy he couldn't outmaneuver or outfight. Patricia had grieved openly, her sobs echoing through their suddenly too large house. Vincent had grieved privately, in his study, staring at military commendations that seemed meaningless against the loss of his child. In the months following Emma's death, Vincent had thrown himself into expanding his business. He opened offices in 6 major cities, recruited the best operatives money could buy, and took on increasingly complex assignments. The work kept his mind occupied during the day, but the nights were different. The nights belonged to Emma's memory and the gnawing emptiness where his daughter's laughter used to fill their home. Patricia had struggled differently. She'd left her nursing job, saying she couldn't bear to be around children who might not make it home to their families. She started spending more time with friends, taking pottery classes, joining book clubs, anything to fill the void. Vincent had supported her choices, understanding that people process grief differently. His own coping mechanism was work and the disciplined routine that had kept him alive in combat zones. But as the months turned into years, Vincent began to notice subtle changes in his wife. She'd become distant, spending entire afternoons away from the house without clear explanations. Her phone was always face down on tables, and she developed a habit of stepping outside to take calls. When Vincent asked about these changes, Patricia would cite grief counseling or support groups, and he'd accepted her explanations because he trusted her implicitly. Trust, Vincent had learned in the military, was the foundation of any successful operation. Without it, teams fell apart, missions failed, and people died. He'd built his marriage on that same principle, giving Patricia complete faith and expecting the same in return. Now, standing in his study on this crisp March evening, Vincent reviewed quarterly reports from his various offices. Business was booming, corporate espionage cases, executive protection details, and crisis management contracts that brought in more money than he'd ever imagined possible. His team was loyal, his reputation was impeccable, and his bank accounts were healthier than ever. Yet something felt wrong. It wasn't anything he could quantify or analyze, just a soldier's instinct that had kept him alive when logic alone wouldn't suffice. Patricia had been acting strangely for weeks, disappearing for hours at a time and returning with explanations that felt rehearsed. She'd also been receiving more phone calls than usual, always stepping away to answer them privately. Vincent closed the financial reports and walked to the window overlooking Emma's garden. Patricia maintained it meticulously, keeping every flower bed exactly as their daughter had preferred. The garden was beautiful, but it was also a shrine to loss, a constant reminder of what they'd failed to protect. Tomorrow marked 5 years since Emma's death. Vincent had planned to spend the day at her gravesite, as he did every year. Patricia usually joined him, but this year she'd mentioned a prior commitment, something about a grief counseling retreat that had been scheduled months in advance. Vincent's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Chun, his head of operations. "Boss, got those background checks you requested on the Morrison family. Nothing unusual in the files, but thought you should know Patricia's cousin Kevin was released from county lockup last month. Drug possession charges." Vincent frowned. Patricia had mentioned Kevin's troubles in passing, but she made it sound like minor traffic violations. Drug charges suggested a more serious problem, and Patricia's evasiveness about her family suddenly took on a different context. He was about to respond when he heard Patricia's car pulling into the driveway. Vincent checked his watch. 9:47 p.m. She'd left that morning for what she described as a day-long therapy session, but most legitimate counseling appointments didn't run this late. Vincent moved away from the window and settled behind his desk, opening a random file to appear busy. Patricia's footsteps echoed through the foyer, followed by the soft click of her heels on the hardwood stairs. She was going directly to their bedroom without stopping to check in, another small deviation from her normal routine. 5 minutes later, she appeared in his study doorway, dressed in clothes he didn't recognize. The black dress was more form-fitting than her usual style, and she was wearing makeup despite claiming to have spent the day in emotional therapy sessions. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that made Vincent's instincts sharpen. "Productive," he replied, studying her face for tells. "How was the counseling session?" "Intense," Patricia said, avoiding direct eye contact. "Dr. Brennan thinks I'm making real progress with the grief work. She wants me to attend a weekend retreat next month." "That's good," Vincent said neutrally. Where is this retreat being held? Patricia hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough for Vincent to notice. Upstate. Some kind of wellness center near Albany. I'll get you the details. Vincent nodded and returned his attention to the file, but his peripheral vision tracked Patricia's movements. She was nervous, shifting her weight from foot to foot in a way that suggested deception. In 20 years of reading people, first as a soldier, then as a security specialist, Vincent had learned to trust these subtle indicators. I'm going to shower and go to bed, Patricia announced. Tomorrow's going to be difficult. I know, Vincent said. I'll be up shortly. After Patricia left, Vincent opened his secure laptop and accessed the private investigation resources his company maintained. Within 30 minutes, he'd confirmed that Dr. Brennan was real, her practice was legitimate, and she did conduct grief counseling sessions. However, according to her office's scheduling system, which Vincent's people had accessed through methods that weren't entirely legal, Patricia Morrison Holloway wasn't listed as a patient. Vincent leaned back in his chair, processing this information with the same methodical approach he'd used to analyze enemy positions in Afghanistan. His wife was lying about her whereabouts, receiving suspicious phone calls, and displaying behavioral patterns consistent with deception. The question wasn't whether Patricia was hiding something, it was what she was hiding and why. He opened another secure channel and sent a message to Sarah Kovalev, his most skilled surveillance operative. Need discreet monitoring on my wife starting tomorrow. Full package, movement tracking, communication intercepts, photographic documentation. Priority assignment. Vincent closed the laptop and walked to the window again, staring out at Emma's garden bathed in moonlight. Somewhere in those carefully tended flower beds lay the foundation of everything he'd built his life around. Love, trust, and the belief that some things were sacred and unbreakable. If Patricia was betraying that foundation, she would learn what every enemy soldier and corporate adversary had discovered. Vincent Holloway was a man who never forgot a betrayal, and he never forgave one either. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Foundation. The morning of Emma's 5th death anniversary dawned gray and cold, matching Vincent's mood as he prepared for the annual pilgrimage to Graceland Cemetery. He'd maintained this ritual every year since the funeral, visiting Emma's grave alone first, then returning in the afternoon with Patricia for their shared remembrance. This year felt different. Patricia had left early, claiming her grief counseling retreat couldn't be rescheduled. She'd kissed his cheek with what felt like genuine remorse, promising to visit Emma's grave when she returned. But Vincent had noticed the small overnight bag in her car was larger than necessary for a day trip, and her explanation about the retreat location had changed from Albany to somewhere near Syracuse. Vincent drove to the cemetery in his black Escalade, taking the route that passed Patricia's favorite coffee shop out of curiosity. Her silver BMW wasn't in the parking lot, despite her claiming she'd stopped there before heading to the retreat. Another small lie in a growing pattern that was making Vincent's instincts scream warnings. At the cemetery, Vincent knelt beside Emma's headstone, a simple granite marker that read, Emma Grace Holloway, beloved daughter. She made everything beautiful. Vincent had chosen those words because Emma had possessed an almost supernatural ability to find wonder in the smallest things. A butterfly landing on her hand, the way morning dew caught sunlight, the intricate patterns of flower petals. I miss you, sweetheart, Vincent said quietly, placing fresh daisies on a grave. Your mom misses you too, though she's been acting strange lately. I think she's struggling more than she lets on. Vincent spent an hour at the gravesite, sharing updates about his work and telling Emma about the new additions to her garden. It was a one-sided conversation, but it helped maintain the connection he'd always shared with his daughter. Emma had been the one person who could make him laugh genuinely, who could penetrate his military stoicism with her infectious curiosity about the world. As he prepared to leave, Vincent's phone buzzed with a message from Sarah Kovalev. Subject departed residence at 7:15 a.m., currently at Riverside Inn on Route 7. Meeting with unidentified male, approximately 35 to 40 years old. Attached photos. Vincent opened the images, and his world shifted on its axis. The first photo showed Patricia sitting across from a man Vincent didn't recognize, tall, dark-haired, wearing a casual button-down shirt that emphasized his athletic build. They were holding hands across the table, and Patricia was smiling in a way Vincent hadn't seen in years. The second photo captured them kissing in the parking lot beside a red pickup truck. The third photo was worse. Patricia and the stranger were entering a room at the Riverside Inn, Patricia's hand on the man's chest in a gesture of obvious intimacy. Vincent stared at the images for a long moment, his military training taking over to suppress the emotional response threatening to overwhelm his analytical mind. Patricia wasn't at a grief counseling retreat. She was with another man at a hotel on the anniversary of their daughter's death, lying about her whereabouts and betraying 15 years of marriage. He forwarded the photos to his secure server and called Sarah. "I need full identification on the male subject. Background check, employment history, criminal record, financial status, everything. Also expand surveillance to include communication monitoring. I want to know how long this has been going on." "Copy that, boss. Should I maintain visual on the subjects?" "Affirmative. Document everything, but maintain distance. I don't want them to know they're being watched." Vincent drove home with the careful precision of a man operating on autopilot. His hands were steady on the steering wheel, his speed exactly at the limit, his route efficient and direct. But inside, something was systematically dismantling itself. The trust that had anchored his marriage, the belief that some things remained sacred even in a world full of betrayal. At home, Vincent went directly to his study and opened Patricia's laptop. He'd given her the password to his personal computers years ago as a gesture of complete trust, and she'd reciprocated. Now that trust was providing Vincent with access to information Patricia clearly hadn't intended him to see. Her email history revealed a pattern of deleted messages, but Vincent's security background had taught him that nothing was ever truly deleted. Using recovery software his company employed for corporate investigations, he retrieved months of communications between Patricia and someone identified only as K in her contacts. The earliest recovered message was dated 8 months ago. "Patricia, it was wonderful seeing you at the grief support meeting. I hope we can continue our conversations about healing. Your strength in dealing with loss is inspiring. K." The messages progressed from there, becoming increasingly personal and intimate. Vincent read through months of exchanges that documented a relationship evolving from supposed grief counseling support to emotional intimacy to clear infidelity. The most recent message, sent that morning, was explicit in its planning. "Can't wait to hold you today. I know anniversaries are hard, but we'll get through this together. I love you. K." Patricia had responded, "I hate lying to Vincent, but he wouldn't understand. He's too rigid, too controlled. He doesn't know how to heal or let others heal. I love you too. See you soon." Vincent closed the laptop and walked to his safe, retrieving a bottle of bourbon he'd been saving for special occasions. He poured 3 fingers of the amber liquid and sat in his leather chair, processing the information with the same methodical approach he'd used to analyze enemy intelligence. The facts were clear. Patricia had been conducting an affair for at least 8 months, possibly longer. She'd used their daughter's death anniversary as cover for a romantic rendezvous with her lover. She'd characterized Vincent as rigid and controlled to justify her betrayal. Most damaging of all, she'd involved their shared grief in this deception, using supposed grief counseling as a cover story. Vincent's phone buzzed with an update from Sarah, subject identified as Keith Morrison, age 38, construction foreman at Morrison Building Company. Divorced, 2 children, lives in Waterbury. Possible relation to subject's family, same last name, investigating connection. Morrison. Patricia's maiden name was Morrison, which meant Keith was likely a relative, possibly the cousin Kevin that Marcus had mentioned or another family member Vincent hadn't met. The betrayal was deepening, involving not just infidelity, but deception about family connections. Vincent finished his bourbon and began planning with the same systematic approach he'd used for military operations and corporate security assignments. Patricia had made several critical errors. She'd underestimated his ability to uncover deception. She'd used their daughter's memory as cover for her betrayal, and she'd involved family members in a conspiracy against him. These weren't just tactical mistakes. They were personal insults that demanded consequences. Vincent opened his secure laptop and began researching Keith Morrison's background, employment, financial status, and personal relationships. Within 2 hours, he had a comprehensive profile of his wife's lover. A divorced construction worker with marginal finances, a history of workplace accidents, and 2 children he barely supported with irregular child support payments. Patricia had left a marriage to a successful businessman who'd provided her with luxury and security for an affair with a blue-collar worker who could barely manage his own life. The motivation clearly wasn't financial improvement, which meant it was either emotional or purely physical attraction. Vincent's military experience had taught him that enemies often revealed their weaknesses through their choices. Patricia's choice to involve family members suggested she was emotionally dependent on their support. Keith's financial struggles indicated he could be pressured through economic leverage. Both of them had children or stepchildren who could be affected by public exposure of their relationship. Most importantly, both Patricia and Keith had something to lose if their affair became public knowledge. Patricia's comfortable lifestyle and social standing, Keith's employment and relationship with his own children. Vincent began drafting a plan that would systematically dismantle everything Patricia and Keith valued, using the same precision and thoroughness he'd applied to enemy targets overseas. But this wouldn't be a quick strike. It would be a methodical campaign designed to make them understand the true cost of betraying Vincent Holloway. His phone rang with Patricia's number. Vincent let it go to voicemail, then listened to her message. "Hi, honey. Just want to check in from the retreat. It's been very emotional, but helpful. I should be home around 8 tonight. Love you." Vincent saved the message as evidence and returned to his planning. Patricia would indeed find the day emotional, though not in the way she expected. By the time Vincent finished with her and Keith Morrison, they would both understand that some betrayals carried consequences that lasted far longer than the pleasure they'd brought. Emma's garden was visible through his study window, a reminder of everything pure and innocent that had been lost. Patricia had polluted that memory by using their daughter's death anniversary as cover for adultery. For that alone, Vincent would make sure she paid a price that matched the magnitude of her betrayal. Chapter 3. Voices from the Garden. Vincent spent the afternoon methodically building surveillance profiles on both Patricia and Keith Morrison. By 5 p.m., he had detailed information about their routines, known associates, financial vulnerabilities, and personal relationships. Patricia would return home soon, expecting to resume her normal life while maintaining her carefully constructed lies. Vincent had other plans. He prepared dinner, Patricia's favorite salmon with asparagus, and opened a bottle of wine they'd been saving for a special occasion. To any observer, it would appear he was planning a romantic evening to commemorate their daughter's memory. In reality, Vincent was creating a baseline for Patricia's behavior, establishing her normal reactions before he began applying pressure. At 8:17 p.m., Patricia's BMW pulled into the driveway. Vincent watched from the kitchen window as she sat in the car for nearly 3 minutes, apparently composing herself before coming inside. When she finally entered through the mudroom, her expression was carefully neutral, the face of someone who'd spent the day practicing deception. "How was the retreat?" Vincent asked, embracing her with the same warmth he'd shown for 15 years of marriage. "Difficult, but helpful," Patricia replied, returning his embrace with what felt like genuine affection. Dr. Brennan introduced some new techniques for processing grief. "I think they might really help." Vincent studied her face, noting the micro-expressions that indicated both relief and continued anxiety. Patricia was committed to maintaining her lie, which suggested she viewed this affair as more than a temporary indiscretion. "I'm glad you're finding healing," Vincent said. "I made dinner. Thought we could honor Emma's memory together." Patricia's eyes filled with tears that appeared genuine. "That's perfect. I've been thinking about her all day." They ate dinner, making conversation about Emma's favorite foods and childhood memories. Patricia seemed more relaxed than she'd been in weeks, as if her day with Keith had somehow refreshed her ability to connect with Vincent. The irony wasn't lost on him. His wife was more affectionate when she was actively cheating than she'd been during their periods of marital difficulty. After dinner, they moved to the living room with wine. Patricia curled against Vincent on the sofa, her head on his shoulder in a gesture that had once felt natural but now seemed calculated. "I want to visit Emma's garden before bed," Patricia said quietly. "Will you come with me?" Vincent agreed, though he found the request troubling. Patricia was asking him to share their daughter's sacred space after spending the day in another man's bed. The violation felt profound, but Vincent masked his reaction behind the stoic expression that had served him in countless high-pressure situations. They walked through the garden together, Patricia pointing out new buds that indicated spring's arrival. Emma had loved this time of year, when the garden emerged from winter dormancy to show the first signs of renewed life. Patricia maintained the space with obsessive care, as if tending Emma's favorite flowers could somehow maintain a connection with their lost daughter. She would have been 12 this year, Patricia said, stopping beside the rose bushes Emma had helped plant in her final summer. Old enough to help with the garden design, maybe developing her own preferences for colors and layouts. Vincent nodded, remembering Emma's detailed plans for expanding the flower beds and adding a butterfly sanctuary. His daughter had possessed a sophisticated understanding of botany for such a young child, able to identify plant species and understand their growing requirements with remarkable accuracy. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, both lost in memories of Emma's enthusiasm for the garden and her plans for its future development. Vincent was about to suggest they go inside when Patricia gasped sharply and grabbed his arm. "Vincent," she whispered, her voice tight with shock. "Do you see her?" Vincent followed Patricia's gaze toward the far corner of the garden, where Emma's butterfly sanctuary had been planned but never built. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the shadowy outline of the garden shed and the tall oak tree where Emma used to read on summer afternoons. Then he saw movement. A small figure stood beside the oak tree, barely visible in the moonlight, but unmistakably child-sized. Vincent's military training kicked in immediately, his hand moving instinctively toward the concealed weapon he always carried. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, the figure became more defined, and Vincent's rational mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The child appeared to be approximately 7 years old, with long hair and wearing what looked like a white dress or nightgown. She was standing perfectly still, facing toward Vincent and Patricia with an expression he couldn't make out from this distance. "Emma," Patricia called softly, her voice breaking with emotion. The figure raised one hand in what might have been a wave, then began walking toward them with the careful, measured steps of a child navigating familiar territory in limited light. As she approached, Vincent's logical mind cataloged impossible details. The child's hair was the exact shade of auburn Emma had inherited from Patricia. Her height and build matched Emma's proportions at age 7, and her movements carried the distinctive grace Emma had displayed even as a toddler. "Father, I'm home," the child said, her voice carrying across the garden with perfect clarity. Vincent's world tilted sideways. The voice was unmistakably Emma's, not similar, not reminiscent, but exactly the same pitch, tone, and cadence their daughter had used. Patricia made a choking sound and stumbled backward against Vincent, her entire body trembling. "This isn't possible," Vincent whispered. But even as he spoke, the child continued approaching with Emma's characteristic confidence in the garden she'd loved so deeply. When she was close enough for Vincent to see her face clearly, his analytical mind simply shut down. The child was Emma. Same green eyes, same scattered freckles across her nose, same slightly crooked smile that had been Emma's most endearing feature. She looked exactly as she had on the day she died, healthy and vibrant and impossibly present in the garden where they'd scattered her ashes 5 years ago. "I couldn't believe my eyes," Vincent murmured, the words coming automatically as his conscious mind struggled to process the impossible scenario unfolding before him. Emma looked directly at Patricia, and Vincent saw tears streaming down his daughter's face, or the face of whatever was standing before them, wearing Emma's appearance. "Actually, Mother," Emma said, her voice carrying a weight of knowledge that no 7-year-old should possess, I need to tell you something important. About Keith Morrison. About the lies you've been telling Father. About what you've been doing on days when you're supposed to be honoring my memory." Patricia made a sound like a wounded animal and collapsed to her knees in the garden soil. Vincent remained standing, his mind racing to understand how this apparition, whether real, supernatural, or some kind of elaborate hallucination, could possibly know about Patricia's affair. "You're not real," Patricia gasped. "You can't be real. Emma is dead. I watched her die. I held her when she took her last breath." The figure that appeared to be Emma tilted her head with the same curious expression their daughter had used when considering a complex question. "I am real, Mother. Real enough to see what you've been doing. Real enough to know how you've been betraying the man who loved us both more than his own life. Real enough to tell him the truth you've been hiding." Vincent's tactical mind began functioning again, analyzing the situation with the same systematic approach he'd use for any intelligence-gathering operation. Whether this was Emma's spirit, a grief-induced hallucination shared by both him and Patricia, or some other phenomenon he couldn't explain, the figure was providing him with confirmation of information he'd already discovered through surveillance. More importantly, Patricia's reaction suggested she believed she was actually seeing their dead daughter. Her guilt and shock were genuine, which meant Vincent could use this moment to extract information she might not reveal under normal circumstances. "Emma," Vincent said carefully, his voice steady despite the impossibility of the situation. "What is it you want to tell me about your mother and Keith Morrison?" The apparition turned toward Vincent with an expression of profound sadness. "She's been lying to you for 8 months, Father. Meeting him at hotels while claiming to attend grief counseling. Using my death as cover for her betrayal. She told him you're too rigid and controlled to understand healing. That she needs someone who can help her process emotions you supposedly can't handle." Patricia was sobbing now, her hands pressed against her face as if she could block out the vision or the accusations. Vincent felt a cold clarity settling over him. Not just from a supernatural revelation, but from seeing Patricia's guilt and shame displayed so nakedly. "She plans to leave you, Father," Emma continued. "Keith has been pressuring her to divorce you and move in with him. She's been transferring money to secret accounts Keith helped her open. They've been planning this for months." Vincent absorbed this information with the same calm he'd shown when receiving intelligence briefings about enemy positions. Patricia was not only cheating, but actively planning to abandon their marriage and steal assets while doing so. The betrayal was comprehensive and premeditated. "Why are you telling me this?" Vincent asked the apparition. "Because she used my memory to cover her lies," Emma replied, her voice carrying an anger that seemed too mature for her apparent age. "Because she betrayed the man who fought harder than anyone to save my life. Because some betrayals are too great to forgive or forget." Emma turned back to Patricia, who was still kneeling in the garden soil. "You have until morning to tell him the truth, Mother. All of it. If you don't, I'll be back tomorrow night, and I won't be alone." The figure that appeared to be Emma began walking backward toward the oak tree, her form becoming less distinct as she moved away from them. When she reached the shadows beneath the tree, she simply faded away, leaving Vincent and Patricia alone in the garden with only the sound of Patricia's broken sobbing. Vincent helped Patricia to her feet and guided her back to the house, his mind already working through the implications of everything he'd witnessed. Whether Emma's appearance had been supernatural, psychological, or something else entirely, it had provided him with crucial intelligence about Patricia's plans and motivations. More importantly, it had given him leverage. Patricia clearly believed she'd seen their dead daughter, and that experience had shattered her composure completely. Vincent could use her guilt and fear to extract the full truth about her affair and her plans to leave him. Then he could begin implementing consequences that would make Patricia and Keith Morrison understand the true cost of betraying Vincent Holloway. As they entered the house, Patricia was still trembling and crying. Vincent guided her to the living room and poured her a glass of wine, playing the role of concerned husband while his mind calculated the tactical advantages this night had provided. "That wasn't real," Patricia kept repeating. "That couldn't have been real. I saw her too. Vincent said quietly. And she seemed to know things about your activities that she couldn't have known unless someone told her. Someone who's been watching us. Patricia looked up at him with terror in her eyes. Not just fear of the supernatural experience, but fear of discovery. She knew Vincent well enough to recognize when he was operating in tactical mode, and she was beginning to understand that her carefully constructed deception was collapsing. "We need to talk," Vincent said, settling into his chair across from her. "About grief counseling retreats that don't exist. About hotel meetings with men I've never met. About the truth you've been hiding while using our daughter's memory as cover." Patricia's face went white, and Vincent knew the real confrontation was about to begin. Chapter 4. The Truth Unraveled. Patricia sat frozen on the living room sofa, her wine glass trembling in her hands as Vincent settled into his leather chair with the calm precision of a military interrogator. The supernatural encounter in the garden had stripped away her carefully maintained composure, leaving her emotionally raw and psychologically vulnerable. Vincent had learned during his military service that the best time to extract information was immediately after a subject had experienced shock or trauma. Patricia's belief that she'd seen their dead daughter had created exactly that kind of psychological break, making her more likely to reveal truths she'd previously hidden. "I've been conducting my own investigation," Vincent said quietly, his voice carrying the neutral tone he'd perfected during combat briefings. "I know about Keith Morrison. I know about the Riverside Inn. I know about the bank accounts and the money transfers. What I want to understand is why." Patricia's face crumpled, and she began crying again, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere profound and broken inside her. Vincent watched her without offering comfort, studying her reactions for signs of genuine remorse versus manipulation. "How long have you known?" Patricia finally managed to ask. "I suspected something was wrong weeks ago," Vincent replied. "I confirmed it this morning when you failed to appear at the grief counseling center you claimed to be attending. My people have been documenting your activities since then." Patricia looked up at him with shock that appeared genuine. "Your people? I run a security company, Patricia. Surveillance and investigation are core competencies. Did you really think you could conduct an 8-month affair without me eventually discovering it?" Patricia set down her wine glass and wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive posture that suggested she was beginning to understand the full scope of her situation. Vincent had resources she'd never considered, and her amateur attempts at deception had been thoroughly penetrated by professional intelligence gathering. "Keith is my cousin," Patricia said quietly. "My mother's nephew. He moved back to Connecticut after his divorce, and he started attending the grief support group, where I was getting help after Emma died." Vincent nodded, filing this information alongside what his research had already revealed. "When did the relationship become intimate?" 8 months ago," Patricia admitted, "but we were friends before that. He understood what I was going through in ways you couldn't. He'd lost someone too. His father died of cancer around the same time Emma got sick." Vincent studied Patricia's expression, noting the defensive tone that suggested she'd rationalized the affair by characterizing it as emotional support rather than betrayal. This was a common pattern among cheating spouses. They reframed their infidelity as meeting legitimate needs their marriage wasn't addressing. "Tell me about the money transfers," Vincent said. Patricia's face went white again. "How did you never mind? Keith has been having financial problems since his divorce. Child support, legal fees, work has been inconsistent. I've been helping him occasionally. You've transferred $47,000 to accounts he controls over the past 6 months, Vincent said, revealing the extent of his investigation. That's not occasional help. That's systematic financial support for your lover using marital assets. Patricia stared at him with growing horror. You've been tracking our bank accounts? I've been tracking everything, Patricia. Phone calls, text messages, email communications, financial transactions, travel patterns, social media activity. Your affair with Keith Morrison is thoroughly documented, including your plans to leave me and establish a permanent relationship with him. Vincent opened his laptop and displayed several photographs Sarah had taken that day. Patricia and Keith embracing at the hotel, entering the room together, Keith's hands on her body, in ways that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. "This is what you were doing on our daughter's death anniversary," Vincent said, his voice remaining calm despite the rage building inside him. "Using Emma's memory as cover while you betrayed 15 years of marriage." Patricia looked at the photos and began crying again, but this time her tears seemed to carry shame rather than just fear. "I know how it looks, but you don't understand what I've been going through. The grief, the loneliness, the feeling that you'd shut down emotionally after Emma died. So you decided to handle your grief by fucking your cousin in hotel rooms while lying about attending therapy sessions," Vincent said, his military bluntness cutting through Patricia's attempts at rationalization. Patricia flinched at his language, but continued trying to explain. "Keith understood what I was feeling. He helped me process emotions I couldn't share with you because you became so distant and focused on work after Emma died." Vincent leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Patricia's face with the intensity he'd once used to interrogate enemy combatants. "I threw myself into work because we'd lost our daughter and I was trying to build financial security for our future. You threw yourself into an affair because facing grief as a married couple was apparently too difficult for you to handle." "It wasn't supposed to happen," Patricia said weakly. "Keith and I were just friends at first. But you were working 18-hour days, traveling constantly, and when you were home you seemed unreachable. Keith was there when I needed someone to talk to." Vincent processed this explanation with clinical detachment. Patricia was describing a classic pattern of emotional infidelity escalating to physical betrayal, justified by perceived neglect within a marriage. But her timeline didn't match the evidence he'd gathered about her deception. "You started lying about your whereabouts 3 months before your first documented sexual encounter with Keith," Vincent said. "The emotional affair began much earlier than you're admitting, and you made deliberate choices to pursue it instead of addressing our marital problems directly." Patricia looked stunned that Vincent possessed such detailed knowledge of her activities. "You've been spying on me for months?" "I've been protecting myself from being made a fool by someone I trusted completely," Vincent replied. "A trust you violated systematically while using our daughter's death as justification for betraying our marriage." Vincent opened another file on his laptop, displaying financial records showing Patricia's secret accounts and the money she'd transferred to Keith. "Tell me about your plans to leave me and move in with Keith Morrison." Patricia's face went completely white. "How could you possibly know about that?" "Because I know everything, Patricia. Every conversation, every plan, every lie you've told to cover your tracks. What I want to understand is whether you intended to file for divorce or simply disappear with as much of our joint assets as you could steal." Patricia stood up abruptly and began pacing, her composure finally cracking completely under the weight of Vincent's comprehensive knowledge of her deception. "This is insane. You've been conducting surveillance on your own wife like I'm some kind of criminal." "You are a criminal," Vincent said calmly. "Theft of marital assets, fraud in obtaining those assets, conspiracy with Keith Morrison to defraud me of property and money. Your affair is adultery, but your financial activities constitute actual felonies." Patricia stopped pacing and stared at him with growing panic. "You can't be serious. You wouldn't actually have me arrested." Vincent closed his laptop and fixed Patricia with the same cold stare he'd once reserved for enemies who'd underestimated his capabilities. "You used our daughter's death as cover to betray our marriage, steal our money, and plan to abandon me for a construction worker who can't support his own children. What exactly makes you think I wouldn't pursue every legal remedy available to me?" Patricia sank back onto the sofa, her hands shaking as she finally began to understand the full scope of her situation. Vincent had comprehensive evidence of her infidelity and financial crimes, gathered through professional surveillance methods she'd never suspected he was capable of deploying. "What do you want?" Patricia asked quietly. "I want the complete truth about your relationship with Keith Morrison, your plans to leave me, and everyone who helped you conceal this betrayal," Vincent said. "Then I want you to understand the consequences of what you've done." Patricia looked toward the window facing Emma's garden, as if she could still see the apparition that had appeared to them earlier. "What if Emma comes back? What if she tells you things I don't want to reveal?" Vincent studied Patricia's expression, realizing she was genuinely terrified of another supernatural encounter. Whether or not Vincent believed their daughter's spirit had actually appeared, Patricia clearly did, and that fear was making her more cooperative than any interrogation technique he could have employed. "Emma already told me the important details," Vincent said. "She said you've been planning to leave me for months, that you've characterized me as too rigid and controlled to understand healing, and that you've been using her memory to cover your lies. Is there anything else you think she might reveal that you'd prefer to tell me yourself?" Patricia wrapped her arms around herself again, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. "Keith wants me to divorce you and move in with him permanently. He's been pressuring me to take half of everything and start over with him." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I needed more time to figure out how to handle the legal aspects," Patricia admitted. "But I was planning to file for divorce after the summer. I wanted to wait until the 5-year anniversary of Emma's death had passed." Vincent absorbed this information with cold fury. Patricia had been planning to wait until their daughter's death anniversary was behind them before abandoning their marriage, as if that timing somehow made her betrayal more palatable. "Anyone else involved in this plan?" Vincent asked. Patricia hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Keith's sister Rebecca has been helping with the financial arrangements. She's a paralegal, and she's been researching divorce laws and asset division strategies." Vincent made a mental note to add Rebecca Morrison to his list of targets for investigation and potential consequences. The conspiracy against him was expanding to include Keith's family members, which meant his response would need to address multiple participants. "Here's what's going to happen," Vincent said, standing up and moving to loom over Patricia. "You're going to call Keith Morrison and tell him this affair is over immediately. You're going to close the secret bank accounts and return every dollar you've stolen. Then you're going to wait while I decide what consequences are appropriate for someone who betrayed me this comprehensively." Patricia looked up at him with terror in her eyes. "What kind of consequences?" Vincent smiled with the same cold expression he'd worn when dealing with enemies who'd made the mistake of underestimating him. "The kind that will make you and Keith Morrison understand that betraying Vincent Holloway was the worst decision either of you has ever made." Chapter 5. The Web of Deception. The next morning, Vincent implemented the first phase of his response plan while Patricia remained in their bedroom, claiming she was too emotionally shattered to face normal activities. Vincent had given her 24 hours to sever all contact with Keith Morrison and begin returning the stolen money. Whether she complied or not, he was moving forward with systematic consequences for everyone involved in the conspiracy against him. Vincent's first call was to Marcus Chun, his head of operations. "I need a complete operational package on Keith Morrison, his sister Rebecca Morrison, and anyone else in their immediate family or social circle. Financial vulnerabilities, employment dependencies, legal exposure, personal relationships that could be leveraged. Full spectrum intelligence gathering." "How deep do you want us to go, boss?" Marcus asked, understanding that Vincent's requests typically meant someone had made a serious mistake. "Deep enough to destroy their lives if they don't cooperate with correcting the situation they've created," Vincent replied. "I want leverage points that will make them understand the true cost of their decisions." Vincent's second call was to Jennifer Walsh, the attorney who handled both his personal and corporate legal matters. Jennifer had represented Vincent through various business disputes and understood his preference for overwhelming legal pressure applied with surgical precision. "I need divorce papers prepared," Vincent told her, "but I want them structured to maximize financial damage and minimize asset division. Also prepare criminal referrals for theft of marital assets and fraud." "What's the situation?" Jennifer asked. Vincent provided her with a concise summary of Patricia's 8-month affair, the financial transfers to Keith Morrison, and the conspiracy to defraud him of marital assets. Jennifer listened without interruption, taking notes that would allow her to craft legal responses designed to achieve maximum impact. "The adultery gives you grounds for fault-based divorce in Connecticut," Jennifer said. "Combined with the financial fraud, we can argue for minimal alimony and favorable asset division. The criminal charges could result in actual felony convictions if the prosecutor decides to pursue them. I want everything prepared but not filed yet," Vincent instructed. I'm going to give them an opportunity to understand their situation before I implement consequences they can't reverse. Vincent's third call was to Tony Rodriguez, a private investigator who specialized in corporate espionage and had occasionally provided services that existed in legal gray areas. Tony understood that certain problems required solutions that traditional law enforcement couldn't provide. I need comprehensive surveillance on Keith Morrison and his sister Rebecca, Vincent said. But I also need you to identify pressure points in their personal lives. Employment situations that could be influenced, relationships that could be complicated, financial obligations that could be accelerated. You want us to develop leverage or just gather intelligence? Tony asked. Both. I want them to understand that crossing me carries consequences that extend far beyond their relationship with my wife. By noon, Vincent had mobilized the full resources of his security company against Keith Morrison and his family. Within hours, he would have detailed intelligence about their vulnerabilities, their relationships, and their dependencies. Then he could begin applying pressure with the same systematic approach he'd used against enemy targets in Afghanistan. Patricia emerged from their bedroom around 2 p.m., looking haggard and emotionally devastated. She'd clearly been crying for hours, and her hands were shaking as she attempted to pour herself coffee in the kitchen. Have you contacted Keith Morrison? Vincent asked, studying her reaction to gauge her compliance with his demands. Patricia nodded without looking at him. I called him this morning. I told him we couldn't see each other anymore. What was his response? He was angry, Patricia admitted. He accused me of letting you intimidate me. He said if I loved him, I wouldn't let you control my decisions. Vincent filed this information as confirmation that Keith Morrison was going to be a problem requiring more aggressive intervention. Men who encouraged women to defy their husbands typically weren't easily discouraged by simple requests to end inappropriate relationships. Did you close the bank accounts? Vincent asked. Patricia hesitated, which provided Vincent with his answer before she spoke. I closed one of them, but Keith said he needed time to transfer money from the other account before I shut it down. He has bills due that require immediate payment. Vincent felt cold fury building in his chest. Patricia was still prioritizing Keith Morrison's financial needs over repairing the damage she'd done to their marriage. Even after being confronted with comprehensive evidence of her betrayal, she was continuing to provide financial support to her lover. How much money is still in Keith Morrison's control? Vincent asked. About $15,000, Patricia said quietly, but he promised to return it within a week. Vincent walked to his laptop and accessed the financial monitoring systems his company maintained. Within minutes, he'd confirmed that no money had been returned to their joint accounts, and Keith Morrison had actually withdrawn additional funds that morning. Keith Morrison withdrew another $3,000 2 hours ago, Vincent said, showing Patricia the transaction records. He's not planning to return your money. He's planning to take as much as possible before you regain control of the accounts. Patricia stared at the computer screen with growing shock. That can't be right. Keith said he just needed to pay his rent and child support before returning the rest. Vincent accessed additional financial records that Marcus had provided about Keith Morrison's spending patterns. Keith Morrison spent $400 at a sports bar last night after you called to end your relationship. He spent another $600 at an electronics store this morning. He's not paying bills. He's going on a spending spree with money he stole from our marriage. Patricia sank into a kitchen chair, her face pale with the realization that Keith Morrison was stealing from her even as she was trying to protect him from Vincent's investigation. I thought he loved me. I thought he was different from other men I'd known. He's a construction worker with marginal finances and a history of failed relationships, Vincent said bluntly. He saw you as an opportunity to improve his situation through your access to my money. The moment you became a liability instead of an asset, he began stealing whatever he could take. Vincent opened another file containing surveillance photos of Keith Morrison's activities that morning. The images showed Keith with a woman Vincent didn't recognize, sharing breakfast at an expensive restaurant, and then entering a jewelry store together. Who is this woman? Vincent asked, displaying the photos for Patricia. Patricia stared at the images with growing horror. That's his ex-wife, Lisa. He told me she was trying to reconcile with him, but he said he wasn't interested because he was committed to our relationship. Vincent pulled up additional surveillance photos showing Keith and Lisa Morrison entering a hotel together after leaving the jewelry store. He bought jewelry for his ex-wife using money he stole from our marriage, then took her to a hotel room for what was obviously a romantic reconciliation. Patricia began crying again, but this time her tears seemed to carry betrayal and anger rather than just grief. He was cheating on me while I was cheating on you. He was using our money to court his ex-wife, which means Keith Morrison is not just an adulterer and a thief, Vincent said. He's also a manipulator who played you for access to financial resources while maintaining other relationships you didn't know about. Vincent closed the laptop and fixed Patricia with the same cold stare he'd used during military interrogations. This is the man you chose to betray our marriage for. This is the man you characterized as understanding and supportive while you criticized me as rigid and controlled. This is the man you were planning to divorce me for and start a new life with. Patricia wrapped her arms around herself, clearly overwhelmed by the comprehensive scope of Keith Morrison's deception. I was such a fool. I believed everything he told me about wanting to build a future together. You were a fool. Vincent agreed without any attempt at softening the assessment. But that doesn't change the fact that you systematically betrayed our marriage, stole our money, and used our daughter's memory as cover for your lies. Keith Morrison, being a manipulative thief, doesn't excuse your choices. Patricia looked up at him with desperate eyes. What can I do to fix this? How can I make this right? Vincent considered her question, analyzing whether Patricia's apparent remorse was genuine or simply another manipulation tactic designed to avoid consequences. Her shock at discovering Keith Morrison's additional betrayals seemed real, but that didn't necessarily mean she was prepared to accept full responsibility for her own actions. First, you're going to help me recover every dollar Keith Morrison stole from our marriage, Vincent said. Then you're going to provide me with complete information about everyone who helped you conceal this affair. Finally, you're going to understand that your marriage to me is over, and your future depends entirely on how cooperative you are with cleaning up the mess you've created. Patricia stared at him with growing panic. You're divorcing me? Our marriage ended the moment you decided to betray it for a construction worker who is obviously using you for financial gain, Vincent replied. The only question now is whether that divorce happens amicably with you retaining some dignity and financial security, or whether it happens after criminal charges that leave you with nothing but legal bills and a felony record. Patricia began crying again, finally understanding that her choices had consequences that extended far beyond the temporary pleasure of her affair with Keith Morrison. Vincent watched her emotional breakdown with cold satisfaction, knowing that this was only the beginning of the justice he would extract from everyone who had betrayed him. His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Chun. Complete intelligence package ready for your review. Keith Morrison and his sister have multiple vulnerabilities we can exploit. Ready to proceed with operational plans when you give the word. Vincent responded with a single word, proceed. The systematic destruction of Keith Morrison and everyone who had helped him would begin within hours. And Vincent intended to make sure they understood that betraying Vincent Holloway carried consequences that lasted far longer than whatever temporary benefits they'd gained from their deception. Chapter 6. The Noose Tightens. Vincent spent the evening in his study, reviewing the comprehensive intelligence packages Marcus had compiled on Keith Morrison and his co-conspirators. The information was more damaging than Vincent had anticipated. Keith Morrison's life was built on a foundation of poor decisions, financial irresponsibility, and interpersonal betrayals that created multiple leverage points for someone with Vincent's resources and skills. Keith Morrison worked for Riverside Construction, a mid-sized company that held several municipal contracts requiring background checks and security clearances for workers. Keith's drug possession charges from 5 years ago had been expunged, but Vincent's people had access to records that could resurrect those criminal issues if properly presented to the right authorities. More importantly, Keith owed substantial back child support to his ex-wife Lisa, and his current employment was the only thing preventing wage garnishment that would reduce his income below survival levels. Keith's relationship with his 2 children was already strained due to his financial irresponsibility, and any disruption to his employment would likely destroy those connections permanently. Rebecca Morrison, Keith's sister, worked as a paralegal for a small law firm that specialized in family court cases. She'd been helping Keith and Patricia plan their financial strategies while simultaneously handling legal paperwork that created conflicts of interest with her professional obligations. Rebecca's employment situation was precarious. She'd been written up twice for attendance issues and was currently on probation for minor workplace infractions. Most interesting of all, Keith Morrison's reconciliation with his ex-wife Lisa appeared to be motivated primarily by his need for stable housing. Keith had been evicted from his apartment 3 months ago for non-payment of rent and had been staying in cheap motels ever since. His affair with Patricia had provided him with financial resources to maintain appearances, but Lisa's willingness to let him move back into their former family home offered him the stability he couldn't achieve independently. Vincent opened his secure communication system and sent coordinated instructions to his team members. By morning, Keith Morrison and his family would begin experiencing consequences that would make them understand the true cost of their conspiracy against Vincent Holloway. Marcus Chun received orders to contact Riverside Construction's bonding company with information about Keith Morrison's drug history and recent financial irregularities. Construction companies couldn't afford to employ workers who pose liability risks, and Keith's position would become untenable once his employer understood his background and current legal exposure. Tony Rodriguez received instructions to approach Lisa Morrison with photographic evidence of Keith's affair with Patricia, along with financial records showing Keith had spent marital assets belonging to another couple on gifts for his paramour. Lisa Morrison was already angry about Keith's inconsistent child support payments. Learning that he'd been funding an affair while neglecting his children would likely result in immediate legal action. Jennifer Walsh received authorization to file criminal complaints against Keith Morrison for theft and fraud, while simultaneously preparing civil suits that would attach any assets Keith might attempt to hide or transfer. Keith's financial situation was precarious enough that even minor legal pressure would create overwhelming stress. Sarah Kovalev received orders to begin comprehensive surveillance of Rebecca Morrison, documenting any activities that might violate her professional ethics obligations or create additional legal exposure. Rebecca's position as a paralegal required her to maintain certain standards of conduct, and her involvement in Patricia's conspiracy could result in professional sanctions that would destroy her career. Vincent also prepared psychological pressure that would be applied to Keith Morrison through channels he'd developed during his military service. Keith Morrison was about to discover that some enemies possessed resources and skills far beyond anything he'd encountered in his limited civilian experience. At midnight, Vincent implemented the first phase of his operational plan. Vincent's phone calls began with David Kumar, the supervisor at Riverside Construction, who was responsible for maintaining the company's security clearances and regulatory compliance. David owed Vincent a favor from a previous security consultation, and he understood that Vincent's recommendations carried serious weight in the local business community. "I need to bring some information to your attention about one of your employees," Vincent said. "Keith Morrison has been involved in activities that could create liability issues for your company and jeopardize your municipal contracts." Vincent provided David with carefully edited information about Keith's drug history, his current legal troubles related to theft charges, and his involvement in financial fraud schemes. David listened with growing concern, understanding that municipal contractors couldn't afford to employ workers with criminal backgrounds or ongoing legal problems. "I'll need to review his employment file and consider our options," David said. "If what you're telling me is accurate, Keith Morrison's continued employment could put our bonding and insurance coverage at risk." Vincent's second call was to Detective Lisa Rodriguez at the Connecticut State Police Financial Crimes Unit. Lisa specialized in prosecuting fraud cases involving theft of marital assets, and she'd worked with Vincent's company on several previous investigations. "I have evidence of systematic theft and fraud involving marital assets," Vincent told her. "The perpetrators have been transferring money to accounts they control while lying about the intended use of those funds. The total amount stolen exceeds $50,000. Vincent provided Lisa with comprehensive documentation of Patricia's transfers to Keith Morrison, along with evidence that Keith had misrepresented his intentions when requesting the money. Lisa reviewed the information and confirmed that Keith's actions met the legal definition of fraud under Connecticut law. "This is definitely prosecutable," Lisa said. "I'll need your wife to file a formal complaint, but we can bring criminal charges against Keith Morrison that could result in felony convictions." Vincent's third call was to Rebecca Morrison's employer, attorney Michael Brennan, who ran the law firm where Rebecca worked as a paralegal. Vincent had researched Michael's background and discovered he was obsessive about maintaining his firm's professional reputation and avoiding any appearance of ethical violations. "I have information about one of your employees that suggests potential ethical violations," Vincent told Michael. "Rebecca Morrison has been providing legal advice to parties involved in a marital fraud scheme while failing to disclose conflicts of interest or obtain proper supervision." Vincent detailed Rebecca's involvement in planning Patricia's financial strategies while simultaneously helping Keith Morrison conceal assets and avoid legal consequences. Michael listened with obvious concern, understanding that ethical violations by his support staff could result in professional sanctions against his entire practice. "I'll need to investigate these allegations immediately," Michael said. "If Rebecca has been providing unsupervised legal advice or participating in fraudulent schemes, her employment with this firm will be terminated immediately." By 3 a.m., Vincent had set in motion a systematic campaign that would destroy Keith Morrison's employment, legal standing, financial security, and family relationships within 72 hours. Keith Morrison would wake up to discover that his affair with Patricia had brought him to the attention of someone with resources and skills far beyond anything he'd imagined possible. Vincent returned to his bedroom to find Patricia still awake, staring at the ceiling with obvious anxiety. She'd heard him making phone calls from his study, and she understood enough about Vincent's capabilities to know he was implementing consequences for Keith Morrison's theft and deception. "What did you do?" Patricia asked quietly. "I protected our interests and ensured Keith Morrison faces appropriate consequences for his actions," Vincent replied. "By tomorrow evening, Keith Morrison will understand that stealing from Vincent Holloway was the worst decision he's ever made." Patricia turned to look at him with growing fear. "You're destroying his life." "Keith Morrison destroyed his own life when he decided to steal from our marriage and manipulate you into betraying me," Vincent said coldly. "I'm simply ensuring he experiences the natural consequences of those choices." Patricia was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of Vincent's response. She'd clearly expected him to be angry about her affair, but she hadn't anticipated the systematic and comprehensive destruction Vincent was capable of implementing against his enemies. "What about me?" Patricia asked. "What consequences do I face?" Vincent turned to look at her with the same cold expression he'd worn when interrogating enemy combatants. "That depends entirely on how cooperative you are with helping me recover our stolen money and how genuinely remorseful you are about betraying our marriage." Patricia nodded silently, finally understanding that her future depended entirely on Vincent's assessment of her value and trustworthiness. She'd gambled everything on an affair with a man who'd been using her for financial gain, and now she was completely dependent on the mercy of the husband she'd betrayed. Vincent closed his eyes and began planning the next phase of his campaign against Keith Morrison and his family. The systematic destruction had only just begun, and Vincent intended to make sure everyone involved understood that some betrayals carried consequences that lasted far longer than whatever temporary pleasure they provided. Chapter 7. The First Strike. Keith Morrison's world began collapsing at 7:43 a.m. when David Kumar called to inform him that his employment with Riverside Construction was being terminated immediately due to irregularities in his background check and ongoing legal issues that pose liability risks to the company. "I don't understand," Keith said, his voice groggy from a night spent drinking with his ex-wife Lisa to celebrate their reconciliation. "My background check was clear when I was hired." "What legal issues?" "We've received information about criminal activities you're involved in," David explained. "Theft charges, fraud allegations, and financial irregularities that could affect our bonding and insurance coverage. You need to turn in your company equipment and clear out your locker by 5 p.m. today." Keith Morrison had never heard of Vincent Holloway, had no idea that his affair with Patricia was being monitored by professional intelligence operatives, and couldn't understand how his carefully hidden financial activities had suddenly become known to his employer. But he was about to learn that some husbands possessed resources far beyond those of ordinary civilians. At 9:15 a.m., Keith received a visit from Detective Lisa Rodriguez, who arrived at his hotel room with a warrant for his arrest on charges of theft of marital assets and fraud. Keith answered the door in his underwear, still disoriented from the previous night's drinking and completely unprepared for the legal consequences of his relationship with Patricia. "Keith Morrison, you're under arrest for theft and fraud involving marital assets belonging to Vincent and Patricia Holloway," Detective Rodriguez announced, displaying her badge and the arrest warrant. "You have the right to remain silent." Keith's protest that he'd been given the money voluntarily fell on deaf ears. Detective Rodriguez had comprehensive documentation showing that Keith had misrepresented his intentions when requesting financial assistance, had violated the terms under which the money was provided, and had continued stealing even after being told to return funds. The booking process took 3 hours, during which Keith was photographed, fingerprinted, and processed into the criminal justice system as a felony defendant. His bail was set at $50,000, far more than Keith could afford, especially since his bank accounts had been frozen as part of the fraud investigation. At 11:30 a.m., while Keith was sitting in a county jail cell wearing orange coveralls and trying to understand how his life had transformed so dramatically, his ex-wife Lisa Morrison received a visit from Tony Rodriguez. Tony presented Lisa with comprehensive photographic evidence of Keith's affair with Patricia Holloway, along with financial records showing that Keith had spent thousands of dollars of stolen money on restaurants, gifts, and hotel rooms for his paramour, while failing to make child support payments for his own children. "Your ex-husband has been stealing money from another couple to fund an extramarital affair," Tony explained, showing Lisa the surveillance photos of Keith and Patricia embracing at various hotels. "This is where the money went that should have been supporting your children." Lisa Morrison stared at the photographs with growing fury. She'd agreed to reconcile with Keith based on his promises that his financial situation had improved and he was ready to be a responsible father and partner. Learning that his apparent prosperity was based on stealing from another family while neglecting their own children ignited a rage that years of disappointment had been building toward. "Where is Keith now?" Lisa asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. "He was arrested this morning on felony theft and fraud charges," Tony replied. "His bail is set at $50,000, and his assets have been frozen pending resolution of the criminal case." Lisa Morrison immediately called her attorney to file for emergency custody modifications that would terminate Keith's visitation rights and accelerate child support collection efforts. She also contacted the local newspaper's crime reporter to ensure Keith's arrest would receive public attention that would make his legal problems more difficult to resolve quietly. At 1:45 p.m., Rebecca Morrison received a call from her employer, attorney Michael Brennan, ordering her to report to his office immediately for termination proceedings. Michael had spent the morning reviewing Rebecca's activities and confirming that she'd been providing unauthorized legal advice while failing to disclose conflicts of interest. "You've been terminated for cause," Michael informed Rebecca when she arrived at his office. "Your involvement in planning fraudulent financial schemes while representing this firm creates liability issues we cannot tolerate." Rebecca's protests that she'd only been helping family members were dismissed by Michael, who understood that ethical violations by support staff could result in professional sanctions against his entire practice. Rebecca's termination was immediate and permanent, with no severance pay and a notation in her employment file that would make finding similar work extremely difficult. At 3:20 p.m., Keith Morrison used his one phone call from county jail to contact Patricia, desperate for bail money and legal assistance. He'd spent hours in lockup trying to understand how his carefully concealed affair had suddenly resulted in arrest, job loss, and comprehensive legal problems. "Patricia, I need your help," Keith pleaded when she answered. "I've been arrested for stealing your money, but you gave it to me voluntarily. I need you to tell the police this is all a misunderstanding." Patricia listened to Keith's desperate requests with growing clarity about the man she'd betrayed her marriage for. Keith Morrison wasn't calling to apologize for deceiving her about his ex-wife or to express concern about the consequences his actions had brought to her marriage. He was calling to demand additional assistance that would require her to lie to law enforcement officers investigating his criminal activities. "I can't help you," Patricia said quietly. "Vincent has comprehensive evidence of everything we did. The police have records showing you lied about needing money for bills when you were actually spending it on your ex-wife and other personal expenses." Keith's voice became angry and demanding. "You owe me this, Patricia. If you hadn't been so weak and let your husband intimidate you, we could have handled this situation before it got out of control." Patricia hung up the phone, finally understanding that Keith Morrison viewed her as an asset to be exploited rather than a person to be loved. His desperate phone call had revealed his true character: manipulative, selfish, and willing to blame others for consequences created by his own choices. At 5:30 p.m., Vincent received comprehensive updates from his team members confirming that Phase 1 of his response plan had been implemented successfully. Keith Morrison was in jail facing felony charges. His employment had been terminated. His ex-wife was pursuing aggressive legal action, and his sister had lost her job due to ethical violations. But Vincent was just getting started. Vincent called Patricia into his study and showed her photographs of Keith Morrison being arrested, processed into jail, and sitting in a holding cell wearing prison coveralls. The images were stark evidence of how quickly Keith's life had collapsed once Vincent applied professional-level pressure. "This is what happens to people who steal from me," Vincent said, displaying the arrest photos on his laptop screen. "Keith Morrison woke up this morning thinking he was getting away with using our money to reconcile with his ex-wife. By evening, he was in jail facing felony charges that could result in years in prison." Patricia stared at the photographs with obvious shock. "You had him arrested?" "I provided law enforcement with evidence of crimes Keith Morrison committed," Vincent corrected. "The police made their own decision to prosecute based on that evidence." Patricia studied the images of Keith in his jail cell, finally understanding the full scope of Vincent's capabilities and resources. "What happens to him now?" "That depends on whether he's smart enough to cooperate with resolving the situation he created," Vincent replied. "If Keith Morrison returns our money and accepts responsibility for his actions, his legal problems might be resolved relatively quickly. If he continues lying and trying to manipulate the situation, his problems will become much worse." Vincent opened another file containing surveillance footage of Keith's desperate phone call to Patricia that afternoon. "Keith Morrison called you from jail, demanding that you lie to police to help him avoid consequences for his crimes. That suggests he hasn't learned anything from this experience yet." Patricia watched the footage of Keith's angry demands that she commit additional crimes to help him avoid punishment for his theft. "He said I owed him help because I was too weak to stand up to you. Keith Morrison is a manipulator who used you for financial gain while maintaining other relationships you didn't know about," Vincent said. "Everything that's happening to him now is the natural consequence of choices he made freely." Vincent closed the laptop and fixed Patricia with the same cold stare he'd used when dealing with enemy combatants who'd underestimated his resolve. "Tomorrow, Keith Morrison will discover that his arrest was only the beginning of the consequences he'll face for stealing from our marriage. By the end of the week, he'll understand that crossing Vincent Holloway was the worst mistake he's ever made." Patricia nodded silently, finally comprehending that Vincent's response to their betrayal was systematic, comprehensive, and far from over. She'd gambled everything on an affair with a man who was now in jail, jobless, and facing felony charges that could destroy his life permanently. The noose was tightening around Keith Morrison, and Vincent intended to make sure it continued tightening until Keith understood the true cost of betraying someone with Vincent's resources and determination. Chapter 8. The Final Blow. Keith Morrison spent 3 days in county jail before his court-appointed attorney managed to arrange bail through a bond that would cost Keith's family everything they owned. By the time Keith was released on Thursday morning, Vincent's systematic campaign had destroyed every aspect of Keith's life with surgical precision. Keith emerged from jail to discover that his sister Rebecca had been fired from her paralegal position and was facing professional sanctions that would prevent her from working in the legal field. His ex-wife Lisa had obtained emergency custody orders, terminating his visitation rights with his children, and was pursuing wage garnishment that would claim 60% of any future income he might earn. Most devastating of all, Keith's reconciliation with Lisa had ended permanently when she learned about his affair with Patricia and his theft of marital assets. Lisa Morrison had filed for a restraining order that prohibited Keith from contacting her or their children, and she provided local media with information about Keith's arrest that had resulted in newspaper coverage of his criminal charges. But Vincent wasn't finished. On Thursday afternoon, Keith Morrison received a visit from two representatives of Riverside Construction's bonding company, who informed him that his employment termination had created liability issues that required him to repay training costs and equipment damages totaling $37,000. This is a standard provision in your employment contract, explained Janet Walsh, the bonding company's recovery specialist. When employees are terminated for cause involving criminal activities, they become liable for training investments and equipment costs incurred by the company. Keith protested that he'd never seen such provisions in his employment paperwork, but Janet produced signed documents that clearly outlined his financial obligations. Keith's attorney reviewed the contracts and confirmed that the terms were legally enforceable. Keith Morrison owed Riverside Construction money he couldn't possibly pay. How am I supposed to come up with $37,000 when I can't even find work? Keith asked desperately. That's not our concern, Janet replied. You have 30 days to arrange payment, or we'll pursue wage garnishment and asset attachment through the courts. Keith Morrison was trapped in a financial nightmare that grew worse every day. His criminal charges carried potential prison sentences of up to 5 years. His employment prospect had been destroyed by his arrest record, and he owed money to multiple parties while his assets remained frozen by the fraud investigation. On Friday morning, Vincent implemented the final phase of his campaign against Keith Morrison. Vincent's call to District Attorney Michael Torres was brief and professional. Torres had worked with Vincent's security company on several high-profile cases and understood that Vincent's information was always accurate and legally solid. I have evidence that Keith Morrison has been making threats against witnesses in his fraud case, Vincent reported. Specifically, he's been pressuring my wife to lie to investigators and commit perjury to help him avoid prosecution. Vincent provided Torres with recordings of Keith's jail phone calls, including his angry demands that Patricia lie to police and his threats to make her pay if she didn't help him beat the criminal charges. Torres reviewed the evidence and confirmed that Keith's actions constituted witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. This adds federal charges to his case, Torres explained. Witness intimidation in federal fraud cases carries mandatory minimum sentences that significantly increase his potential prison time. Keith Morrison was arrested again on Friday afternoon, this time on federal charges that made bail nearly impossible and carried sentences that would keep him in prison for years. His court-appointed attorney reviewed the new charges and advised Keith that his only realistic option was to plead guilty and hope for a reduced sentence through cooperation with authorities. But Keith Morrison's problems were about to become much worse. On Saturday morning, Vincent received an encrypted message from Tony Rodriguez containing intelligence that would provide Vincent with the final leverage he needed to destroy Keith Morrison completely. The message contained financial records showing that Keith Morrison had been stealing from Riverside Construction for months before his affair with Patricia began. Keith had been inflating material costs on municipal projects and keeping the difference for personal use, a scheme that had netted him approximately $20,000 in stolen public funds. More damaging still, Keith had been providing confidential bid information to competing contractors in exchange for cash payments that had allowed certain companies to underbid Riverside Construction on lucrative municipal contracts. Keith's corruption had cost his employer hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost revenue, while enriching himself and his co-conspirators. Vincent immediately contacted Detective Rodriguez with this new information, providing her with comprehensive documentation of Keith Morrison's theft from his employer and his conspiracy to defraud municipal governments. This changes everything, Detective Rodriguez said after reviewing Vincent's evidence. Keith Morrison wasn't just stealing from your marriage. He was stealing from taxpayers and conspiring to defraud government contracts. These are major felony charges that carry decades in prison. Detective Rodriguez contacted federal prosecutors, who immediately opened an investigation into Keith Morrison's construction fraud schemes. Within hours, Keith was facing additional charges that carried potential sentences of 20 to 30 years in federal prison. Keith Morrison's attorney reviewed the expanded charges and advised him that his legal situation had become hopeless. You're looking at multiple felony convictions on state and federal charges that could keep you in prison for most of your adult life, the attorney explained. Your only option is complete cooperation with authorities and hope for significant sentence reductions. On Sunday evening, Keith Morrison called Patricia from his federal holding cell, his voice broken and desperate. "Patricia, I need you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen," Keith said, his earlier anger replaced by obvious despair. "I thought I could handle the situation, but this Vincent guy has resources I never imagined." Patricia listened to Keith's defeated tone with a mixture of pity and relief that she was no longer connected to his criminal activities. "What are you going to do?" "My attorney says I have to plead guilty to everything and cooperate with the investigation," Keith replied. "They're offering me 12 years in federal prison if I provide information about everyone who helped me steal from the construction company." Patricia absorbed this information with growing understanding of how completely Vincent had outmaneuvered Keith Morrison. 12 years. That's if I cooperate fully, Keith said. If I try to fight the charges, I could get 30 years or more. Vincent Holloway has evidence of crimes I didn't even know he knew about. Keith Morrison was financially ruined, professionally destroyed, and facing more than a decade in federal prison. His children had been taken away. His ex-wife despised him. His sister had lost her career because of his actions, and his future consisted of nothing but legal battles and imprisonment. Vincent Holloway had systematically dismantled Keith Morrison's entire existence using methods that were completely legal but utterly devastating in their scope and precision. On Monday morning, Patricia found Vincent in his study reviewing financial documents related to recovering their stolen assets. Keith Morrison's cooperation with federal authorities was expediting the return of their money, and civil judgments would ensure Patricia recovered every dollar Keith had stolen. "It's over," Patricia said quietly, settling into the chair across from Vincent's desk. Vincent looked up from his paperwork with the same cold expression he'd maintained throughout the entire campaign against Keith Morrison. "Keith Morrison's punishment is over. Your consequences are just beginning." Patricia stared at him with growing fear. "What do you mean?" Vincent opened his laptop and displayed divorce papers that had been prepared for immediate filing. "Keith Morrison was a thief and a manipulator who used you to steal from our marriage. But you were the one who chose to betray our marriage, and you were the one who used our daughter's memory to cover your lies." Patricia studied the divorce documents with growing panic. "I thought if I helped you get the money back and cooperated with ending the affair, we might be able to work things out. Our marriage ended the moment you decided to betray it," Vincent said coldly. "What happened to Keith Morrison was justice for his crimes. What happens to you is justice for yours." Vincent had destroyed Keith Morrison as an example of what happened to people who stole from him. Now Patricia would learn what happened to people who betrayed him. A lesson that would be different from Keith's punishment, but equally comprehensive in its scope and devastating in its impact. The final phase of Vincent's campaign was about to begin, and Patricia was about to discover that her husband's capacity for systematic revenge extended far beyond anything Keith Morrison had experienced. Chapter 9. The Garden's Final Secret. 2 weeks after Keith Morrison was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, Patricia signed the divorce papers that would end her marriage to Vincent and leave her with minimal assets and no alimony. Vincent's comprehensive documentation of her adultery and financial fraud had made any legal challenge to his terms impossible, and Patricia's attorney had advised her that cooperation was her only option for avoiding criminal charges herself. Patricia would receive their old house in Hartford, the modest home they'd owned before Vincent's business success, along with enough money to survive for approximately 2 years if she lived frugally. Vincent would retain the estate, his business, all investment accounts, and the majority of their joint assets. Patricia's affair had cost her 15 years of marriage and financial security that would have lasted her lifetime. On her final night in the estate, Patricia walked through Emma's garden one last time, remembering the supernatural encounter that had triggered the discovery of her affair and Keith Morrison's betrayal. The garden was beautiful in the moonlight, every flower and plant perfectly maintained as a living memorial to their daughter. Patricia was about to return to the house when she heard footsteps behind her. "Father, I'm home," came Emma's voice, exactly as clear and recognizable as it had been 2 weeks earlier. Patricia turned to see the same apparition of their 7-year-old daughter, wearing the same white dress and displaying the same ethereal presence that had terrified and amazed them before. But this time, Emma wasn't alone. Standing beside Emma was Vincent himself. Not the current Vincent, but Vincent as he'd appeared 7 years ago when Emma was still alive. He looked younger, less hardened by grief and military discipline, wearing the casual clothes he'd preferred for family time rather than the business suits that had become his uniform after Emma's death. "Hello, Patricia," the younger Vincent said, his voice carrying warmth that the current Vincent had lost over years of building his security empire. "Emma wanted to say goodbye before you leave." Patricia stared at both apparitions with shock that surpassed her original encounter with Emma alone. "You're both dead?" "I'm not dead," the younger Vincent replied. "But the man you married, the man who laughed with Emma in this garden and believed marriage was sacred, he died when Emma did. What's left is someone else entirely." Emma moved closer to Patricia, her expression carrying the same mature wisdom that had seemed so unnatural during their first encounter. "Mother, I need you to understand something important about Father." Patricia knelt down to Emma's eye level, her hands shaking as she tried to process this impossible conversation. "What do you need me to understand?" "Father loved us more than his own life," Emma said. "When I got sick, he spent every dollar he had and called in every favor he'd earned trying to save me. When that wasn't enough, he made deals with people who demanded payment in ways that changed him forever." The younger Vincent nodded sadly. "I promised Emma I would do anything to save her. Anything. When conventional medicine failed, I contacted people with access to experimental treatments that weren't available through normal channels." Patricia listened with growing horror as the implications became clear. "What kind of deals?" "The kind that require me to use my military skills for purposes that had nothing to do with serving my country," the younger Vincent replied. "The kind that connected me with criminal organizations who had resources doctors couldn't access. The kind that turned me into someone who could systematically destroy human lives without feeling remorse." Emma reached out and took Patricia's hand, her touch feeling surprisingly solid and warm. "Father saved my life, twice using treatments he obtained through those connections. But the cancer came back stronger each time, and the people who helped him demanded more and more in return." "What do they demand?" Patricia asked, though she was beginning to understand the answer. "They wanted him to become one of them," the younger Vincent explained. "They wanted a former military operative who could solve problems that required violence and intimidation. They wanted someone who understood tactics and strategy and had no moral limitations when pursuing objectives." Patricia stared at the apparition of her husband, finally understanding how the warm, loving man she'd married had transformed into the cold, calculating strategist who destroyed Keith Morrison with surgical precision. "Vincent sold his soul to save Emma's life," Patricia whispered. "And when Emma died anyway, the man who'd made that bargain died with her," the younger Vincent confirmed. "What survived was someone who'd learned that love and loyalty meant nothing, that only power and control could protect what mattered, and that betrayal deserved consequences that lasted forever." Emma squeezed Patricia's hand gently. "Mother, you betrayed the man who'd given up everything to save my life. You used my memory to cover lies while cheating on someone who'd literally sold his soul, trying to keep me alive." Patricia began crying, finally understanding the full magnitude of what she'd done. "I didn't know. He never told me about any of this. Because the man who made those sacrifices died with me," Emma said. "What's left doesn't remember love or forgiveness or healing. It only remembers that betrayal requires punishment and that some sins can never be forgiven. The younger Vincent moved closer to Patricia, his expression carrying profound sadness. I want you to understand that Vincent isn't cruel or evil. He's just become someone who can't trust or forgive, because doing so would require him to feel emotions that died with Emma. Patricia looked toward the house where the current Vincent was probably working in his study, planning or managing the empire he'd built on the foundation of the deals he'd made to save their daughter. "Is there any way to reach the man you used to be?" Patricia asked. Emma and the younger Vincent exchanged a look that suggested they'd already considered this question extensively. "The man I was died, believing that love and sacrifice could overcome anything," the younger Vincent said. "What replaced him believes that only power and control can prevent loss. Those beliefs are incompatible." Emma released Patricia's hand and stepped back toward the oak tree where she'd first appeared. "Mother, you need to understand that Father's punishment of you and Keith Morrison wasn't about revenge. It was about enforcing the only moral code he has left. That betrayal requires consequences." "Will I ever see you again?" Patricia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Emma smiled with the same sweetness she'd shown as a living child. "You'll see me in the flowers you plant in your new garden, in the children you might help as a nurse again, in the kindness you show to people who are grieving what they've lost." The younger Vincent nodded farewell to Patricia. "Take care of yourself, and don't try to save the man I became. That's not your responsibility anymore." Both apparitions began walking backward toward the oak tree, their forms becoming less distinct as they moved away from Patricia. When they reached the shadows beneath the tree, they simply faded away, leaving Patricia alone in the garden with only the sound of wind through the leaves. Patricia returned to the house and finished packing her belongings, understanding now that her marriage had ended not when she began her affair with Keith Morrison, but 5 years earlier when Emma died and Vincent's desperate attempts to save her had transformed him into someone who could no longer love or forgive. The next morning, Patricia moved out of the estate and into the modest house in Hartford that would be her new home. Vincent was already at his office when she left, maintaining his routine of systematic work that kept him functional but not truly alive. As Patricia drove away from the estate for the final time, she looked back at Emma's garden through her rearview mirror. The garden would continue to bloom under Vincent's care, a perfect memorial to a daughter who died despite her father's willingness to sacrifice everything to save her. Patricia understood now that Vincent's transformation wasn't cruelty. It was the logical result of a man who'd learned that love led to loss, trust led to betrayal, and mercy led to repeated victimization. Keith Morrison had stolen from someone who'd already given up everything that mattered, and Patricia had betrayed someone who'd already sacrificed his humanity trying to save what he loved most. Vincent Holloway would continue building his empire and implementing consequences for those who crossed him. But the man who'd once laughed with Emma in the garden and believed marriage was sacred would never return.